From rejection to ruler of blood and bones, this monster absorbed every quirk he touched, regenerated from brain shots, and turned Japan's heroes into history's biggest graveyard. Villains kneeled like dogs, and the League got erased. He ate the symbol of evil and left the world on its knees. Izuku Midoriya is the Fedora god who rebuilt society in his image. Fear the reincarnation.
Welcome, Legends, to Chronos Recom. I wrote this story myself, so if you have any suggestions or what-ifs you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Also, just wanted to let you know I've got a Patreon set up now for anyone who wants to support the channel directly. You can get early access to stories, submit direct fan requests, and get exclusive content. It's totally optional, but if you want to help keep these stories coming, check it out. Links in the description. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let's dive into this story.
His name was Izuku Midoriya. You already know the version of him from the news. The missing boy, the presumed dead kid from Musutafu, whose face sat on a police bulletin for 6 weeks before somebody decided the file wasn't worth the storage space. Quirkless. Bullied. The kind of child the system was designed to forget. And the system did forget him. Right up until he walked back into the light wearing a white fedora and a suit that cost more than most heroes make in a month, with eyes that had turned the color of old blood and a smile that made grown men lose the feeling in their legs. This is the story of his rise. Every body, every scream, every empire he built on the bones of the one that came before it. I'm telling it to you the way it happened. Fast, loud, and with the kind of brutality that makes you check over your shoulder even though you know the thing you're afraid of is already inside the room. We start where it started, with All Might, with a rooftop, with the last lie a boy was ever told before he stopped being a boy entirely. Toshinori Yagi, the symbol of peace, the man whose fist held the sky up for everyone else, stood on that rooftop in his deflated form, steam still rolling off his skeletal frame, and looked at the boy who had just watched him transform. Izuku had followed him. Had grabbed onto his leg during the jump, actually, because the boy had a question and he was going to ask it even if it killed him. That question was the same one he had been carrying since the doctor's office at age 4, the one that sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit up. Can I be a hero, even without a quirk? All Might looked at him, thin, tired, bleeding internally from wounds the public would never see. And because he was tired, and because the truth is easier than hope when you don't have the energy for kindness, he said what he said. I'm sorry, young man. Without a power, I don't think you can be a hero. He said more than that, actually. He talked about realistic career paths. He talked about police work, about support roles, about all the boxes the system had built for people who didn't fit the main one. He meant it to be helpful. He meant it to be honest, but what Izuku heard, what the thing sleeping inside Izuku heard, was something much simpler and much older than career advice. You are nothing. The strong have decided, and you are nothing. Izuku stood on that rooftop for 11 minutes after All Might left. The wind was blowing. The city was spread out below him, towers and highways and hero agency billboards lighting up the skyline in neon pinks and electric blues. Somewhere down there, Katsuki Bakugo was telling his friends about the villain he'd survived, embellishing the parts where he screamed. Somewhere down there, Inko Midoriya was making dinner and leaving the porch light on because her son was late again. Izuku looked at all of it. The city. The people. The system they lived inside, the one that ranked human beings by the genetic lottery of their birth and called it justice. Something in his chest moved. It wasn't his heart. It was lower than that, and older, and it had been waiting for this exact moment. The moment when the last thread connecting Izuku Midoriya to the idea of being a hero snapped clean. He walked off the rooftop, down the stairs, into the street. The sun was going down, and the alley that ran behind the train station was already filling with shadow. The sludge villain had escaped from All Might. That's the part nobody talks about because it makes the symbol of peace look sloppy, and nobody wants to admit that the pillar holding up the ceiling has cracks in it. All Might had captured the thing in a soda bottle, a 2-liter plastic soda bottle, if you can believe that, and it had slipped out during the jump when Izuku grabbed onto his leg. The villain had poured out of the bottle cap and into the drainage system underneath the city. Furious and starving and looking for a body to crawl inside, it found Izuku in the alley behind the station. The attack was fast. The sludge villain was a predator, and Izuku was a scrawny kid with tears drying on his face and a backpack full of hero analysis notebooks. The living sludge wrapped around his body like a fist, surged up his chest and forced itself into his mouth and nose and eyes. It was suffocating him. It was wearing him. It was laughing while it did it, because this was what the thing did. It consumed people from the inside out and puppeted whatever was left. "Don't struggle, kid," the villain gurgled through its own mass. "It'll hurt less if you just..." Izuku's eyes changed. The green emptied out of his irises like water draining from a sink. What replaced it was a deep, saturated plum red, and the pupils narrowed into vertical slits, feline, alien, and focused with an intensity that had nothing to do with the boy who'd been standing on that rooftop 3 minutes ago. His jaw opened, wider than a human jaw should, then wider than that. The hinge of his mandible cracked and reformed in the same instant, and behind his lips, rows of teeth pushed through his gums in overlapping lines, long, triangular, serrated at the edges like the kind of teeth that belonged in the fossil record of something the oceans stopped making 100 million years ago. The sludge villain felt the change before it understood the change. The body it was trying to suffocate had stopped struggling. That should have been a good sign. It was the opposite. Izuku swallowed. The suction started in his throat and spread outward through his entire body, every pore opening, every cell pulling inward, like a drain had opened at the center of him. The sludge that was supposed to be suffocating him began to flow in the wrong direction, away from the outside, away from the villain's core, and into Izuku's body through every available surface. His skin was drinking. His mouth was a furnace. The mass of the villain, its sentient, quirk-infused cellular structure, was being absorbed, broken down, and rebuilt into something useful at a speed that should have violated every law of thermodynamics the universe had agreed on. The sludge villain screamed. It was a wet, gargling sound, because the thing screaming was already halfway inside the boy it had tried to kill. Its mass shrank. Its face, the crude, liquid approximation of a face it wore, stretched toward Izuku's open mouth like taffy being pulled into a furnace. It tried to pull away. The suction held. It tried to split itself, to leave half its body behind and escape with the rest. The suction held. Every molecule of the villain's body was being catalogued, deconstructed, and filed into Izuku Midoriya's cellular memory, like data being written to a hard drive that had infinite storage and zero mercy. In 4 seconds, the sludge villain was gone. The alley was empty except for Izuku. He stood in the half-light between 2 buildings, his school uniform damp with residue that was already evaporating into his skin. His jaw was closed. His teeth, the new ones, had retracted. His eyes were still red. He raised his hands and looked at them. Pale. Smooth. The fingertips were slightly elongated, the nails sharper than they had been a minute ago. He flexed his fingers and felt the sludge villain's quirk factor settling into his system like a new organ being installed. The ability to liquefy and reshape his mass, layered on top of something far more ancient and far more powerful that was already running through every vein in his body. He understood what he was. The knowledge arrived without fanfare, without a tutorial screen, without a guiding voice from the heavens explaining his new powers in bullet point format. It arrived the way memory arrives, sudden, total, and already familiar. He was Muzan Kibutsuji. He had been Muzan Kibutsuji. 1,000 years of existence, of hunger, of a war fought in moonlight against slayers who smelled like wisteria and carried blades that burned. All of it was there, stacked in his cells like geological layers, every lifetime, every death, every evolution preserved in the architecture of his body and waiting for this exact moment to wake up. He didn't cry. That's the part that matters, so let me say it again. He didn't cry. He didn't scream, didn't fall to his knees, didn't call out for his mother or whisper, what's happening to me like every Quirk Awakening story you've ever seen on the evening news. He just stood there, flexing his new fingers, breathing air that tasted different now because his senses had expanded to a range that could pick up individual heartbeats 3 blocks away. And he smiled. That night, Izuku Midoriya went home for the last time. He opened the door the way he always did, with his key, because his mother kept the lock on after sundown. He took off his shoes in the entryway. He could smell dinner from the kitchen, katsudon, pork cutlet bowls, because his mother made them whenever she thought he'd had a rough day, and she thought he had rough days more often than he actually told her about. Inko Midoriya was standing at the stove with her back to him. She was humming something. A song from a commercial, maybe, or something older that she'd learned from her own mother. She was a small woman with green hair and soft hands and a quirk that could pull small objects toward her. A 4 on a 10-point scale if you were being generous, which the Hero Society was not. Izuku? Is that you, honey? Dinner's almost ready. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her. He could hear her heartbeat from across the room. He could hear the blood moving through her veins, arterial flow, venous return, the rhythm of a 42-year-old woman who ate too much salt and worried too much, and had spent the last 10 years loving a son the world told her was defective. He could hear all of it, and the sound made him feel nothing. That's the horror of this story, right there. The first real horror, before the bodies start piling up and the hero commission starts losing sleep. A boy stands in his mother's kitchen and listens to the sound of her being alive, and it moves him the way the sound of traffic moves you. Ambient noise, background data, something happening nearby that has nothing to do with where you're going. "I'm home," he said, and he sat down and ate dinner with her, and the food tasted like ash and carbon because his palate had already shifted towards something the human menu doesn't include. After she went to bed, he moved. He took nothing. He left his notebooks. He left his All Might posters and his action figures and every scrap of hero merchandise he'd spent his allowance on since he was 4 years old. He left his phone on the kitchen table, unlocked, with the screen open to a text thread with his mother that ended with her sending a heart emoji at noon. He walked to the waterfront. He left his shoes at the edge of the pier, positioned the way police training manuals describe, which is to say side by side, toes pointing toward the water, the laces tucked in. He had read those manuals. He had read everything, because Izuku Midoriya was an analyst before he was a monster. And the analytical mind is a tool the monster finds extremely useful. His backpack went into the water. The splash was small. A security camera on the far end of the pier caught a blurry figure standing at the edge, and then the figure was gone, and the backpack sank. And by morning, the missing persons report was already being drafted by a patrol officer who didn't know she was filing paperwork on behalf of the last god the world would ever produce. Inko Midoriya called the police at 6:47 a.m. when she found his phone and his empty room and his shoes missing from the entryway. By noon, the pier footage had been reviewed. By evening, the search had shifted from missing to recovery. By the end of the week, Izuku Midoriya was a closed case with an open wound. A mother who would leave the porch light on for 2 more years, waiting for a door that would never open the way she hoped. The boy was gone. What wore his face was already 3 prefectures away, walking in broad daylight, eating its first real meal. A drifter who had fallen asleep under a bridge and woke up just long enough to see teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth before the seeing stopped. And here's where the story splits from everything you know. Because in the world you're used to, the one with the hero schools and the rankings and the licensing exams, this is the part where the protagonist gets discovered by a mentor, given a power and told he's special. He trains, he cries, he makes friends, he earns his place. None of that happened here. What happened here is that a predator woke up in the body of a child the world had already written off, and instead of asking for permission to exist, he began to build a kingdom. Every brick of that kingdom was red, and every brick was earned with someone else's blood. The system had 14 months before he came back into the light. 14 months of silence while the creature that used to be Izuku Midoriya, moved through the margins of Japanese society like a virus learning its host. He fed. That is the simplest way to say it. And there is a certain honesty in simplicity. Over those 14 months, the creature wearing Izuku Midoriya's face fed on the margins, the homeless, the forgotten, the people who fell through the cracks in a society that was too busy ranking heroes to notice the bodies piling up in places the cameras didn't reach. Each meal added mass, added information, added the faint shimmer of quirk factors absorbed through consumption and integrated into a cellular library that grew more sophisticated with every kill. He learned to shapeshift the way a musician learns an instrument, through repetition, through testing the boundaries of what his body could do, and then pushing past them because the boundaries were suggestions and his cells were obedient. He could change his face, he could change his height, his build, his skin tone, the color of his hair. He could walk into a coffee shop as a businessman in his 40s and leave as a college student in a hoodie, and the barista would never connect the two. His flesh was a tool that answered to his will at the molecular level, and he used it the way a programmer uses code, to build, to test, to iterate. He watched the hero society from the inside of its own skin. He attended press conferences wearing the faces of reporters. He sat in police stations wearing the faces of officers. He read classified files, internalized patrol routes, mapped the blind spots in the Hero Commission's surveillance network, and cataloged every crack in the foundation of a system that believed itself invincible because it had never met anything designed to eat it. And he began to think about infrastructure. Power without structure is vandalism. Muzan Kibutsuji had understood this 1,000 years ago, and the memory of that understanding was carved into Izuku's cells like firmware. The original 12 Kizuki, the 12 demon moons who served as his generals, his enforcers, his extended will, had been the architecture of an empire that lasted centuries. That architecture needed to be rebuilt. Better, faster. Adapted to a world that had quirks and hero agencies and satellite surveillance instead of samurai and wisteria forests and sun-fearing night creatures. The first brick of that new architecture was bleeding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Yokohama when Izuku found her. Himiko Toga was 16 years old, covered in someone else's blood and crying. The blood belonged to a cat. She'd caught it in the alley behind the warehouse, and she'd opened its throat with a box cutter, and she'd drunk from the wound because her body demanded blood the way other bodies demanded water. Constantly, desperately, with a need that didn't care about morality or legality or the look on her parents' faces when they found out what their daughter was. Her quirk, transform, required blood ingestion to function. She could become anyone whose blood she consumed. The Hero Society looked at this ability and saw a monster. Her parents looked at this ability and saw a mistake. The police looked at this ability and saw a warrant. She'd been on the run for 8 months, sleeping in condemned buildings, eating from garbage cans, drinking animal blood because the alternative was hunting people, and she was 16 and she was tired, and some part of her still remembered what it felt like to want to be normal. That part was dying when Izuku walked in. He entered the warehouse through the front door because he had long since stopped using entrances that suggested he was sneaking. The door was rusted and hanging off one hinge, and it screamed when he pushed it open. A long, metallic shriek that echoed through the empty space and made Toga spin around with the box cutter in her hand and blood on her chin, and the wide, feral eyes of an animal that has been cornered so many times it doesn't know how to do anything else. He was wearing the suit. The white fedora, his eyes were amber green, his hair was the same forest green mop it had always been, and his skin was pale in a way that suggested either aristocracy or something that hadn't seen sunlight in a very long time. Except he'd been walking in sunlight all day, and the irony of that was something only he could appreciate. Toga felt him before she processed him visually. Every hair on her arms stood up, her pupils dilated. The predatory instincts her quirk had wired into her nervous system, the ones that let her track blood by smell and identify threats by the way they moved, fired every alarm they had. This was something bigger than her. This was something bigger than anything she had ever encountered, and the signal it was sending to every survival center in her brain was a single, unanimous instruction. Run. She didn't run. She raised the box cutter instead, because Himiko Toga had spent 8 months learning that running didn't work, and fighting was at least more interesting. "Stay back," she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. "I'll cut you. I swear I'll cut you." Izuku stopped 6 feet from her. He regarded her the way an architect regards a ruin, assessing the foundation, imagining what could be built there. His expression was composed. His hands were at his sides. He smelled the cat blood on her face and understood everything about her situation in the time it took her to blink. "You crave blood because this pathetic society denies your nature," he said. His voice was even, unhurried, and carried the weight of a statement that had been true for 1,000 years before she was born. "I can give you eternity, and a world where you may drink until you drown." Toga stared at him. The box cutter trembled in her grip. She had been told her entire life that her desire for blood was a sickness, a defect, something that needed to be medicated, supervised, restrained, and ultimately punished. Every person who had ever spoken to her about her quirk had spoken with the tone of someone managing a hazard. And now this boy, this thing wearing the shape of a boy, standing in a condemned warehouse with the posture of someone who owned the building and the city it sat in, was calling it nature, was calling it something she deserved to indulge. "Who are you?" she whispered. "The only person in this world qualified to answer your prayers," Izuku said, and he meant it the way a judge means a verdict, with the full weight of finality and the complete absence of doubt. He closed the distance between them in a single step. Toga swung the box cutter. He caught her wrist without looking at the blade, the way you might catch a child's thrown toy, reflexive, effortless, and faintly amused. His other hand came up and one fingernail, just one, the index finger of his right hand, extended to a point sharper than any scalpel ever manufactured by human hands. He pierced the side of her neck. The nail went in clean, through skin, through muscle, into the vein that ran along the left side of her throat. And through that nail, through the hollow channel that had opened in its center like a hypodermic needle made of bone, his blood entered her body. The effect was immediate and absolute. Toga screamed. The box cutter fell from her hand and clattered on the concrete. Her legs buckled. She hit the floor on her knees and then her side, convulsing, her back arching so hard, her spine looked like it was trying to exit through her chest. Every cell in her body was being rewritten. Every strand of DNA unraveled and rewoven around a new template, one that was 1,000 years old and had been refined across hundreds of incarnations until it was something the word evolution couldn't contain. Her veins turned black under her skin. Her eyes rolled back, her teeth sharpened in her mouth, splitting her gums, and the blood that poured out was her own old blood. The human blood being rejected and replaced by something that ran thicker and hotter and carried instructions at the molecular level that made her body the property of the thing standing over her. She screamed until her vocal cords tore. Then her vocal cords healed, and she screamed again. Izuku watched. He stood over her writhing body with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression unchanged, the way a chemist watches a reaction proceed through its expected stages. This was transformation. This was creation. It was ugly and it was agonizing, and it was the most important thing he had done since waking up in that alleyway. Because this girl, this bleeding, screaming, breaking girl, was becoming the first soldier in an army that would make the hero society's worst nightmares look like bedtime stories. The convulsions lasted 3 minutes and 41 seconds. When they stopped, the silence in the warehouse was thick enough to touch. Toga lay on the concrete, breathing. Her wounds, the ones from her weeks of living rough, the scratches, the bruises, the infected cut on her left shin, were gone. Her skin was flawless. Her muscle density had tripled. Her eyes, when she opened them, were brighter than before. The gold of her irises ringed with a faint red that pulsed like a heartbeat. She sat up and looked at Izuku, and the expression on her face was something that doesn't have a clean name. It was devotion, and it was terror, and it was gratitude, and it was the particular brand of love that a creation feels for its creator. Vast, cellular, inescapable. She was his because her DNA said so. She was his because the blood pumping through her rebuilt heart carried his signature in every platelet. And underneath that compulsion, In whatever space was left for a thing that used to be Himiko Toga, there was something worse. She was glad. She had spent 16 years being told she was wrong. Every cell in her body now told her she was complete. "My king," she said, and the words came out like breathing, involuntary, natural, and true in a way that the word true is usually afraid to commit to. Izuku looked down at her. His expression remained the same, composed, unreadable, the face of something that has just added a tool to its collection and is already thinking about the next one. "Rise," he said. "You are upper rank 2 of the 12 Kazuki. My word is absolute. Do you understand?" "Yes," Toga said, and she rose, and the girl who stood up from that warehouse floor was something the world had never seen before. A demon in the modern age, standing in full daylight with a quirk that had been amplified beyond its original ceiling, and a body that could regenerate from injuries that would have killed her 10 times over in her previous life. She was faster than any hero she'd ever seen. She was stronger than the Nomu prototypes that the League of Villains was building in their underground labs. And she was bound to Izuku Midoriya at a level so fundamental that betrayal wasn't just impossible. The concept itself couldn't form in her brain. That was the first moon, the first of 12. And the irony, the rich, savage irony that makes this story what it is that the Hero Society had created her. They'd taken a girl whose quirk demanded blood and treated her like a biohazard instead of a person, and then they'd acted surprised when a real monster showed up and offered her what they never would: acceptance, purpose, and the freedom to be exactly what she was. Izuku left the warehouse with Toga walking 2 steps behind him, and the sun was high and the city was loud, and somewhere in a Hero Commission office in Tokyo, an analyst looked at a pattern of disappearances along the coast and thinking the word cereal for the first time, and they had absolutely, catastrophically, hilariously underestimated what they were looking at. 3 months after Toga's conversion, Izuku turned his attention to the Shi Hasaikai. If you don't know the name, you didn't grow up in the kind of neighborhood where it mattered. The Shi Hasaikai was a Yakuza syndicate. Old school, traditional, the kind of organization that still used ink tattoos and formal hierarchy and considered itself the backbone of an underworld. The heroes pretended didn't exist. Their leader was a man named Kai Chisaki, and his quirk was called Overhaul, and it let him disassemble and reassemble anything he touched at the molecular level. He could turn a brick wall into a tidal wave of spikes. He could reduce a human body to its component atoms and then rebuild it with the organs rearranged. He wore a plague doctor's mask and believed, with the conviction of a true zealot, that quirks were a disease and he was the cure. He also had a child locked in a basement. Her name was Eri. She was 6 years old. Her quirk, Rewind, could reverse a person's body to a previous state, rewinding their cells through time. Chisaki was using her blood to manufacture bullets that could erase quirks permanently. He was harvesting her, taking her apart, using her quirk's rewind to put her back together, and then taking her apart again, over and over. A cycle of agony that had been running for longer than anyone with a functioning conscience should have been able to tolerate. Izuku didn't come for Eri because he had a conscience. He came because he understood, with the pattern recognition instinct of something that had been engineering its own evolution for a millennium, that Eri's blood was the most valuable substance on the planet. Rewind at the cellular level, the ability to roll back mutations, to undo transformations, to reset a body's clock. In the hands of someone who was already rewriting human DNA through blood injection, that power was a skeleton key to the next stage of demon creation. He came for the infrastructure, too. The Hasaikai had money, real estate, weapons caches, supply chains, and the kind of organizational depth that takes decades to build. Izuku needed all of it. He intended to take all of it. The difference between intention and execution for Izuku Midoriya was the length of time it took him to walk through the front door. He walked through the front door. The Hasaikai compound sat behind walls that were 3 feet thick at the base, topped with razor wire and monitored by cameras that fed into a security room staffed around the clock. The front gate was iron, reinforced with steel crossbars, and guarded by 4 men who had been chosen for this duty because they were loyal, they were armed, and they were willing to shoot first and explain later. Izuku walked up to the gate at 11 in the morning, wearing his white fedora and a three-piece suit, the color of charcoal, with Toga trailing 3 steps behind him in a new outfit, all black, fitted, with a utility belt that held 6 knives and 2 syringes filled with her own blood for rapid transformation. His stride was unhurried, his hands were in his pockets, his eyes were amber green, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man arriving at a property he has already purchased. The first guard saw him and reached for his radio. The second guard raised a submachine gun. The third shouted a warning in Japanese that was loud and profane and contained the word stop 3 times in 4 seconds. The fourth guard opened fire. The bullet hit Izuku in the forehead. This is the part that gets reported wrong every single time someone tells this story. So let me be exact about what happened next. And I use the phrase "what happened" loosely, because the guards who survived this encounter couldn't agree on the details even under oath. The bullet entered his skull above the left eyebrow. It traveled through skin, through bone, and into the prefrontal cortex of his brain. He should have died. Every medical textbook, every forensics manual, every action movie ever made says that a bullet to the brain at close range ends the conversation. Izuku's head rocked back an inch. The entry wound closed. The bullet, the actual bullet, the copper-jacketed lead projectile that had just been inside his brain, pushed back out through his skin and fell to the ground with a small, tinny sound. The skin sealed behind it, smooth and pale and unbroken, as if the wound had been a suggestion his body had considered and politely declined. He kept walking. The guards opened fire with everything they had. Submachine guns, pistols, a shotgun, someone pulled from behind the guard station. The noise was enormous, the kind of sustained automatic fire that sounds like the world is being torn apart at the seams. Bullets hit Izuku in the chest, the throat, the face, the arms, the legs. Each one entered his body, was deconstructed at the cellular level in less than 1/10 of a second, and expelled as his flesh regenerated around the wound track before the next round even arrived. He walked through the gunfire the way you walk through rain, mildly aware of it, fundamentally unbothered. "Such noisy insects," he said, and the words were audible even over the gunfire because his voice carried the way thunder carries, from a place that has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with presence. His arms extended. That's the polite way to say it. What actually happened is that the flesh of his forearm split open along seams that had appeared in his skin like fault lines, and from those seams erupted long, jagged tendrils of bone-reinforced tissue. 8 of them, 4 from each arm, each one as thick as a man's thigh, and covered in barbed ridges that caught the light like rows of fishhooks. They moved with a speed that the human eye could follow only in retrospect, after the damage was done, and the brain had time to process what it had just failed to see in real time. The 4 guards at the gate were killed in less time than it takes to finish reading this sentence. The whips moved through them, through armor, through flesh, through the iron bars of the gate itself, and what remained on the other side was abstract. Pieces. The kind of aftermath that makes forensic teams request transfers. The gate itself was sheared into ribbons of twisted metal that fell inward like a curtain dropping, and Izuku stepped over the threshold into the compound's courtyard without adjusting his stride. The courtyard erupted. 26 armed Hasaikai soldiers responded to the breach. They poured from doors and stairwells and covered positions, weapons up, training kicking in, the muscle memory of men who had been preparing for a raid by heroes or a rival gang for years. They were professionals. They were organized. They were facing something that had as much in common with a hero raid as a forest fire has in common with a campfire. The tendrils from Izuku's arms swept the courtyard in a single lateral arc. The motion was fluid, a conductor moving a baton through the air if the baton was 30 feet long and made of bladed flesh, and the orchestra was 26 men who had approximately half a second to understand that they were dead. The sound was brief, a wet structural sound, like a tree falling through a building. Then the courtyard was empty of standing men, and the walls were painted in a pattern that the human brain refuses to process as having once been people. Toga walked behind him, stepping over the remains with the indifferent grace of someone navigating puddles after a rainstorm. She was smiling. She always smiled now, a wide, bright expression that reached her eyes and never left. The perpetual contentment of a creature living in accordance with its nature for the first time. They entered the main building. The interior of the Hasaikai compound was a labyrinth of hallways, rooms, and underground levels designed by people who had spent decades anticipating intrusion. There were traps, reinforced doors, kill corridors with crossfire positions built into the walls. All of it was engineered to slow an attacker, to funnel them into kill zones, to buy time for the leadership to escape through routes that only they knew. Izuku walked through the labyrinth at the same pace he'd been walking since the front gate. Traps triggered and hit him and accomplished nothing. Reinforced doors held for the length of time it took his whips to carve through them. Kill corridors became graves for the men staffing them, because the whips moved around corners and through walls, and the concept of cover is meaningless when the thing attacking you can extend its reach through solid concrete. The Haseikai members who survived the courtyard and the hallways, 12 of them, by the time Izuku reached the central chamber, were on their knees before he got there. Some were crying. One had his hands clasped in prayer. The rest just knelt, because when you have watched an unkillable thing walk through your best defenses the way a hot wire walks through foam, the body makes decisions the mind hasn't authorized yet, and most of those decisions start with the knees hitting the floor. Kai Chisaki was waiting in the central chamber. He was standing. That mattered to him. The act of standing, of facing the thing that had just liquefied his organization with the posture of a man who refused to kneel. His mask was on. His golden eyes were focused. His gloves were off, and his bare hands, the instruments of his quirk, the tools that could unmake and remake matter itself, were flexed at his sides. "You've made a mess of my house," Chisaki said, and his voice was steady. "I'll take you apart for that. Cell by cell, I'll rebuild you into something useful." Izuku stopped walking for the first time since the front gate. He looked at Chisaki the way a collector looks at an interesting specimen, with attention, with evaluation, and without any consideration that the specimen might have opinions about being collected. "You disassemble matter at the atomic level," Izuku said. "That is a remarkable quirk, wasted on someone who uses it to torture a child and manufacture bullets." Chisaki's golden eyes narrowed above his mask. "You know about Eri?" "I know everything about your operation," Izuku said. "I have been inside your organization for 6 weeks. I have worn the faces of 3 of your subordinates. I have read your financial records, your shipping manifests, and the research notes you keep in the locked cabinet behind your desk, the ones detailing the process by which you extract Eri's blood." The silence that followed was the kind that makes ears ring. Chisaki's composure cracked, just a fraction, a micro-expression around his eyes that anyone who wasn't watching for it would have missed. But Izuku was watching for it. He was always watching. Chisaki attacked. His right hand slammed into the floor, and the floor responded. Concrete erupted upward in a wave of jagged spikes, reshaping itself according to Chisaki's will, the stone becoming a forest of razor-edged pillars that shot toward Izuku at the speed of a piston press. It was a devastating opening move, the kind that would have impaled any hero in the top 20 and turned anyone below that rank into modern art. Izuku moved through the spikes the way water moves through a pipe, flowing around edges, between gaps, his body shifting and adjusting its profile at the cellular level to avoid contact when avoidance was easy and absorbing impact when it wasn't. A spike punched through his left shoulder. His flesh closed around it, consumed the stone at the point of penetration, and sealed the wound before the next spike arrived. Another spike hit his thigh. Same result. His body treated the assault the way an ocean treats a thrown stone, acknowledging it briefly and then continuing to be the ocean. Chisaki threw everything. He converted the walls into projectiles. He turned the ceiling into a crushing press. He disassembled the support pillars and rebuilt them as battering rams that struck from 4 directions simultaneously. The room was reshaping itself around them. A living weapon wielded by a man whose quirk gave him authority over the physical world at its most fundamental level. Izuku walked through all of it. His suit was torn. His fedora was knocked off his head by a stone projectile that caved in his skull on the right side, and was rewarded for this accomplishment by watching the skull repair itself in real time. Bone reforming, skin reknitting, hair regrowing. In the 2 seconds it took for the fedora to hit the floor. He picked up the fedora, dusted it off, and put it back on. The students at UA would later describe this moment, or rather, the rumor of this moment, because the security footage from the Hassaikai compound would become classified faster than almost any document in Hero Commission history. As the moment they understood that whatever Izuku Midoriya was, he existed in a weight class that had nothing to do with heroics or villainy. He was something else. Something that played by rules the rest of the world hadn't been invited to read. Chisaki was breathing hard. His quirk consumed stamina. Every use of overhaul cost him physically. Neural fatigue, muscular strain, the cognitive load of processing molecular disassembly at the speed of combat. He had thrown his best at this thing, and the thing had walked through his best while adjusting its hat. "What are you?" Chisaki breathed. Izuku was in front of him before the question mark landed. He moved, and the word moved does a disservice to the action, because what happened was closer to teleportation than locomotion. One moment he was 12 feet away. The next, his hand was around Chisaki's throat, and the grip was firm enough to restrict airflow without closing the windpipe entirely. Because Izuku wanted him conscious for this. He wanted those golden eyes open. Chisaki's right hand slapped against Izuku's forearm. His quirk fired. The molecular disassembly sequence initiated. Chisaki's power reaching into Izuku's cells and beginning to take them apart. Atom by atom, unzipping the biological structure of his forearm the way a seamstress unzips a garment. Izuku's cells rebuilt faster than they came apart. The effect was visible. Chisaki's quirk would strip away a centimeter of tissue, and 2 centimeters would grow back in the same instant. The arm wasn't just healing, it was outpacing the damage, adding mass, thickening, the cells reproducing at a rate that turned Chisaki's quirk from a weapon into a mild inconvenience. It was like trying to empty a pool with a teaspoon while a fire hose filled it from the other end. Chisaki's eyes went wide above his mask. For the first time in his life, his quirk was irrelevant. The power that had made him a king, the ability to unmake anything he touched, was failing against flesh that rewrote itself faster than he could erase it. "You seek to cure the world?" Izuku said, and his voice was the same measured tone it had been since the front gate, because nothing that had happened in this building had required him to raise it. "I am the only cure." He ate Chisaki. I need to describe this. I need to because it's important to understand what Izuku's consumption ability actually looks like in practice, and because the 5 Hassaikai members who witnessed it through the chamber's observation window, the ones who survived because they were behind reinforced glass and too terrified to move, described it in sworn statements that were subsequently classified. And those statements all agreed on the details even though the men giving them were visibly shaking. Izuku's jaw opened. The same unhinging, the same rows of teeth. His mouth widened past the boundaries of human facial anatomy, and additional mouths opened across his chest and abdomen. Smaller ones, ringed with teeth, each one functioning as an independent intake point. The mouths bit into Chisaki's body from multiple angles simultaneously. They consumed flesh, bone, organ tissue, and neural matter at a rate that turned a grown man into nothing in less than 3 seconds. The sounds were the worst part, according to the statements. Wet, industrial sounds. The kind of sounds a garbage disposal makes when it's working at full capacity. When it was over, Izuku's body had absorbed everything Chisaki was. His mass, his quirk factor, the ability to disassemble and reassemble matter at the molecular level, now added to Izuku's growing catalog of consumed abilities. His knowledge of the Hasaikai's networks, his contacts, his financial passwords, his understanding of Ares' rewind blood and the bullet manufacturing process. All of it was filed into Izuku's cellular memory, alongside the sludge villain's quirk, and the dozens of other abilities he'd consumed during his 14 months in the shadows. He straightened his suit. He adjusted his fedora. He turned to the observation window, where the 5 surviving Hassaikai members were staring at him through reinforced glass with expressions that had moved past fear into something closer to religious experience. Your previous employer is gone, Izuku said, and his voice carried through the glass as if the barrier was a suggestion. Your new employer is speaking to you now. Kneel or join him. They knelt. Every one of them. They knelt so fast that two of them cracked their kneecaps on the concrete floor and didn't notice until hours later. Toga retrieved Eri from the basement. The child was in a room that looked like a hospital ward designed by someone who had never experienced empathy. There were restraints on the bed, there were IV lines, there were collection apparatus for blood extraction that still had residue in the tubes. Eri was sitting on the bed, bandaged in places, unbandaged in others, her red eyes wide and empty, in the way that children's eyes become empty when pain has been the only constant in their lives for long enough that the absence of pain becomes suspicious. Toga carried her out. She carried her with a tenderness that seemed wrong, coming from a demon who had watched her master devour a man alive minutes ago. But Toga's emotions had always been a house of contradictions, and the demon conversion hadn't changed that. It had just given the contradictions sharper teeth. Izuku looked at Eri once. He assessed her the way he assessed everything, as a resource, as a variable, as a piece of the machine he was building. Her rewind blood could refine his demon creation process. It could expand the limits of what his blood injection could accomplish in a human body. It could potentially be the key to creating Kazuki, who retained more of their original personality while being even more firmly bound to his will. He offered her nothing resembling comfort. He refused to kneel, refused to promise safety, refused to whisper the kind of lies adults whisper to children in pain. Eri had been transferred from one owner to another, and the new owner simply had a more sophisticated use for her abilities. The Hasaikai compound was his before the sun went down. The money, the weapons, the underground networks that connected Chisaki's operation to suppliers and buyers across 6 prefectures, the research labs, the bullet manufacturing facilities. Every brick of the empire Chisaki had spent years building now belonged to Izuku Midoriya, claimed through the simplest and oldest method of acquisition in the history of the world. He walked in, he killed the king, and he sat down in the king's chair. The Hero Commission didn't learn about the change in ownership for another 3 weeks. When they did, it was because the crime patterns in the area had shifted so radically that the analysts couldn't explain it. The Hasaikai's territory was clean. The drug trafficking had stopped. The protection rackets had gone silent. Everything was still there. The compound, the soldiers, the infrastructure. But it was operating differently now, with a smoothness and a discipline that the old Hasaikai had never managed. The analysts wrote reports. They held meetings. They flagged it as anomalous. They moved on to the next crisis because the Hero Society had a lot of crises and a limited attention span, and the idea that something worse than the League of Villains was building itself in the basement of the world was, at that point, still unthinkable. The USJ, the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, was a state-of-the-art training facility attached to UA High School, the most prestigious hero academy in Japan. It was designed to simulate disaster scenarios: floods, fires, landslides, urban collapse. The students of Class 1A were brought there on a field trip to learn how to rescue civilians in dangerous environments, supervised by the erasure hero Aizawa Shota and the space hero 13. What they learned instead was how to survive. The League of Villains attacked the USJ through a warp gate at 10:42 a.m. on a Wednesday. Tamura Shigaraki, the League's leader, a thin, twitching man covered in severed hands who could decay anything he touched with all 5 fingers, stepped through the gate with an army of low-rank villains and one biological weapon that had cost his benefactor months to produce, the Nomu. It stood behind Shigaraki like a wall of muscle with exposed brain tissue and dead eyes. It was engineered for a single purpose: to kill all might. It had shock absorption. It had super regeneration. It was the League of Villains' answer to the symbol of peace, a mass-produced weapon designed to tank the strongest punches in the world and keep standing. Shigaraki delivered his monologue. Villains always delivered monologues. It was a professional hazard of an industry that mistook volume for authority. He talked about killing All Might, about ending the age of heroes, about the revolution he was going to spark by demonstrating that Even the greatest hero could bleed. The students were scattered across the facility by the warp villain Kurogiri. Some ended up in the flood zone, some in the mountain zone, some in the fire zone. Bakugo and Kirishima fought their way out of the collapse zone with raw aggression and hardening quirks. Todoroki froze an entire section of the facility solid to immobilize villains who were, honestly, out of their depth against even first-year students. The low-rank villains were cannon fodder, bodies to fill space, distractions to keep the students busy, while Shigaraki focused on Aizawa and waited for All Might to arrive. Aizawa fought. He fought well. A one-man wrecking crew who erased quirks with his gaze and broke bones with capture weapons and hand-to-hand combat that was fast, efficient, and absolutely inadequate for what happened next. The Nomu caught him. It grabbed his right elbow and snapped it. Then it broke his other arm. Then it pressed his face into the concrete until the concrete cracked, and Aizawa's goggles cracked with it, and the students who could see what was happening screamed, and the students who couldn't heard the screams and understood. Shigaraki was grinning behind the hand on his face. "This is the end of the symbol of peace," he said, scratching at his neck with a compulsive, anxious energy that looked absurd and menacing in equal measure. "When All Might gets here, the Nomu will kill him, and the world will see that their precious number one is just." The ceiling broke. Let me be specific. The reinforced glass dome that covered the central plaza of the USJ, a dome designed to withstand simulated natural disasters, rated for typhoon force winds and seismic impacts, cracked from a single point of impact and fell inward in a cascade of broken glass and twisted steel framing that rained down on the plaza like a storm of razors. A figure dropped through the gap. He landed in the center of the plaza, 20 feet from Shigaraki, 15 feet from the Nomu, directly in the line of sight of every student, villain, and hero in the facility. He landed on his feet, absorbing the impact through his knees and straightening his back in a single fluid motion that ended with him adjusting the brim of his white fedora. The suit was immaculate. The tie was straight. His hair was green, swept back under the fedora, and his skin was pale in a way that caught the light like marble. His eyes were already red, plum red, cat slit, and scanning the room with the unhurried attention of someone deciding where to begin. The temperature in the USJ dropped. Everyone felt it. Students, villains, heroes, every person in that facility experienced the same physiological response at the same time, a full-body alarm that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the part of the brain that still remembers what it was like to be prey. The hair on their arms rose, their breathing changed, their muscles locked. Some of them took a step back without deciding to. Mineta, the small student with the sticky ball quirk, vomited on his own shoes. Uraraka grabbed Ida's arm and held on because the signal her body was sending was that something was very wrong, and proximity to another human being was the only response that felt available. The aura Izuku radiated had nothing to do with quirks. It was older than that. It was the biological signature of an apex predator, a living broadcast that communicated at the cellular level that the thing standing in the center of the room was at the top of a food chain that included everything else present. Shigaraki stared at him with wide red eyes visible above the hand covering his face. Who the hell are you?" Izuku didn't answer. He was looking at the Nomu. The Nomu looked back with its blank, lifeless eyes. It was built for combat. It was built for All Might. It was standing 8 feet from something that made All Might's threat profile look like a rounding error, and the rudimentary brain tissue exposed at the top of its skull was firing every available signal in a pattern that, if the creature had been capable of translating it into words, would have formed a single phrase, "wrong target." Shigaraki made the decision for it. "Nomu, kill him." The Nomu charged. It was fast. Credit where it's due. The thing Shigaraki's benefactor had built was fast. It crossed the 20 feet between itself and Izuku in less than a second, fists forward, every engineered muscle firing in sequence. A biological battering ram designed to hit with the force of a freight train and absorb whatever came back. Izuku's back erupted. The suit jacket split along seams that appeared between one heartbeat and the next, and from his spine, from the muscles layered over his shoulder blades and running down the length of his back, 8 tendrils of bladed flesh extended in a radial pattern, each one different from the whips he'd used at the Hasaikai compound. These were thicker, denser. The edges were serrated with rows of interlocking teeth that rotated along the length of the tendril like chainsaw blades running on biological motors. They spread behind him like the limbs of something that belonged at the bottom of an ocean trench, and they moved with a speed that made the Nomu's charge look like a leisurely jog. The Nomu was cut into pieces before it could throw a punch. 8 tendrils, 8 simultaneous cuts. The Nomu's body separated along 8 different planes in the time it takes a human eye to register motion. Arms from torso, legs from pelvis, head from neck. The cuts were instant and total, and the pieces fell to the floor of the USJ with wet, heavy sounds that echoed through a facility that had gone so silent you could hear the glass still settling from the broken dome. Then the regeneration kicked in. The Nomu's pieces began to knit back together. Super regeneration, the quirk engineered into its cellular structure, activated, pulling the severed parts back toward each other, reconnecting tissue, rebuilding what had been destroyed. It was a grotesque sight. Chunks of meat crawling across the floor toward each other, veins extending like tentacles, bones reaching for their severed partners. Izuku's blood was already on every cut. The tendrils that had sliced the Nomu apart were coated in it. His blood, the toxic, ancient, mutagenic compound that ran through his veins and carried instructions at the molecular level that superseded any quirk, any genetic modification, any biological engineering a human scientist could devise. Where his blood touched the Nomu's exposed tissues, those tissues stopped regenerating. They destabilized. The cells, which had been programmed to rebuild, received contradictory instructions from Izuku's blood, instructions that overwrote their programming and replaced it with chaos. The Nomu melted. There is a better way to say that, but there isn't a more accurate way. The biological weapon that had been built to kill all might, the creature that could absorb any impact and heal any wound, melted on the floor of the USJ like wax in a furnace. Its tissues liquefied, its bones softened, its regeneration fire. Quirk fought against Izuku's blood and lost badly, the way a calculator loses to a supercomputer. The process took 6 seconds. At the end of those 6 seconds, the Nomu was a puddle of gray-white organic sludge on the plaza floor, steaming faintly, and the students of Class 1A were staring at the spot where it had been with expressions that ranged from blank shock to the kind of visceral horror that rewires a person's understanding of what the world actually is. Kirishima, the hardening student with the sharp teeth and the loud voice, said, "What the f—" He didn't finish the word. His jaw was still open, but nothing else was coming out. Beside him, Bakugo, Katsuki Bakugo, the explosion quirk prodigy who had spent his entire life believing he was the strongest person in every room, was standing rigid, his palms sparking reflexively, his eyes locked on Izuku with an expression that mixed recognition with something he had never felt before and would never admit to feeling. Fear, because Bakugo recognized him. Underneath the suit and the fedora and the red eyes and the pale skin and the nightmare aura, Bakugo recognized the face. He knew those freckles. He knew that jawline. He knew the boy he had spent 10 years pushing into lockers and telling to give up, and the collision between what he was remembering and what he was seeing created a dissonance in his brain so severe that his body forgot how to produce sound for 11 straight seconds. Todoroki, ice already formed across his right arm, whispered to Yaoyorozu, "What is that?" Yaoyorozu, whose encyclopedic quirk knowledge had failed to produce a single relevant reference, shook her head. She had nothing. The creation hero student, who could manufacture any object she understood the molecular structure of, was staring at Izuku, the way a physics student stares at a phenomenon that violates every established law. Her mind was searching for a category, a classification, a box to put this thing in, and every box she tried was too small. Shigaraki was hyperventilating. His plan, his grand plan, his video game boss battle plan to kill All Might and prove that heroes were obsolete had just been reduced to sludge on the floor by something he hadn't accounted for. His hands were shaking. The hand on his face was slipping. His red eyes were darting between Izuku and the exits, and the body language of a man who thought he was the final boss of this scenario was rapidly becoming the body language of someone who has realized he's a side character in a story that doesn't need him. "Who are you?" Shigaraki screamed, and the scream cracked on the last word because screaming at Izuku Midoriya was like screaming at the weather. It changed nothing, and it made you look small. Izuku turned his red eyes on Shigaraki without moving his body, just his eyes. Just the slow lateral rotation of those plum-red pupils tracking from the Nomu's remains to the man who had given the order. The motion was small. The weight of it was enormous. Every person in the USJ felt the pressure of that gaze, even the ones it wasn't directed at. A physical sensation, a compression in the chest, a sudden difficulty breathing, as if the air in the room had decided to side with the thing in the white fedora. "I alone am the absolute," Izuku said. "You have a right to nothing, least of all answers from me." He turned away from Shigaraki. He turned away the way you turn away from a television playing a show you've lost interest in. Completely, finally, with the totality of someone who has dismissed you from the record of things worth engaging with. Shigaraki could have attacked. He could have lunged forward with his decay quirk and tried to put all 5 fingers on Izuku's back. The thought occurred to him. His body rejected the thought before his brain could finish processing it, because the part of Shigaraki that was still an animal understood, with a clarity that his conscious mind would spend weeks trying to deny, that touching the thing in the suit would end him. Izuku walked toward the exit. He passed the students. He passed them without looking at them, the way you pass furniture in a room you're crossing to reach the door. Uraraka pressed herself against a pillar. Ida took 3 steps back and assumed a defensive stance that his body knew was meaningless, even as it committed to it. Tsuyu Asui, the frog quirk student whose instincts were keener than most of her classmates, croaked softly and pressed herself flat against the ground, her body executing the closest approximation of camouflage that her quirk would allow. Bakugo stood in his path. He stood there with his palms crackling, his jaw locked, and his eyes burning with the particular agony of a person whose entire identity has just been set on fire. He had spent a decade being the best, the strongest, the kid with the best quirk, the highest grades, the most promising future. He had told Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless, useless, worthless Izuku Midoriya, to jump off a roof and pray for a quirk in the next life. And now that Izuku was standing 3 feet from him, radiating an aura that made his palms sweat through their own nitroglycerin and looking at him with the indifferent regard of something that has moved so far beyond rivalry that the concept itself is quaint. "Midoriya?" Bakugo said, and the name came out hoarse and flat and stripped of every ounce of superiority he'd ever packed into it. "What happened to you?" Izuku stopped. For the first time since dropping through the ceiling, he acknowledged a student directly. His red eyes settled on Bakugo's face, and the corner of his mouth twitched. The faintest suggestion of amusement or memory or something colder than either. "I became what this world refused to let me be, Bakugo," Izuku said. "The difference between us is that you needed their permission. I stopped asking." He walked past Bakugo, and Bakugo let him. And that was the thing that would keep Bakugo awake at 3 in the morning for months. The fact that he let him. That every muscle in his body had screamed to move and nothing had moved. Because the thing walking past him had communicated, without a single wasted gesture, that attempting to stop it would be the last decision Katsuki Bakugo ever made. Izuku left the USJ. He walked out through the destroyed main entrance, past the unconscious villains Aizawa had dropped before the Nomu broke him, past the scattered glass and the cracked concrete, and into the sunlight. Toga was waiting outside, leaning against a tree with a knife in one hand and a phone in the other, scrolling through news feeds with the absent-minded contentment of someone waiting for a friend to finish shopping. Behind them, in the USJ, the sound of sirens was building. Heroes were on their way. All Might was on his way. The media was on its way. The next 24 hours would produce a storm of reports, press conferences, emergency sessions, and speculation that would dominate every news cycle in the country. The students' testimonies would be taken, their accounts would be filed, and every single one of those accounts, from 20 different perspectives, would converge on the same impossible set of facts. Something had walked into the USJ, destroyed the League of Villains' ultimate weapon in seconds, spoken to Shigaraki as if he were an insect, and left without engaging a single hero. Every account would include the same detail. The thing was neither hero nor villain. It belonged to a category that didn't exist yet, and the system lacked any protocol for dealing with something it couldn't classify. Aizawa, from his hospital bed with both arms in casts and his face wrapped in gauze, told the Hero Commission investigator the same thing the students told their debriefers. Whatever walked into that facility, it wasn't there for us. We were beneath its attention. And that's the part that should scare you. It scared them. For about 2 weeks. Then the next crisis hit, and the bureaucracy moved on, because the Hero Society was a machine built for reacting to threats it understood, and Izuku Midoriya was a threat it couldn't even name. Hosu City burned 3 weeks later. The League of Villains, still reeling from the USJ humiliation, released 3 Nomu into the streets of Hosu in an attempt to prove that they were still relevant. The Nomu were smaller than the one at the USJ, less powerful, less sophisticated, more like attack dogs than apex predators. They rampaged through commercial districts, flipping cars, cracking buildings, and generating exactly the kind of headline-worthy chaos that Shigaraki needed to remind the world that the League existed and was dangerous. The heroes responded. Endeavor, the number 2 hero, the man who burned hotter than anyone else in the country and resented every day he spent being second, was in Hosu that night on unrelated business, and he threw himself at the Nomu with the kind of fury that suggested he was angry at something beyond the villains. Manual was there, Native was there, a half-dozen sidekicks from local agencies deployed and fought and bled in the streets, while the fire department tried to keep the collateral damage from spreading. And in the gaps between the explosions and the hero fights and the evacuation orders, Stain was working. The hero killer, Chizome Akaguro, though nobody used that name anymore, moved through the burning streets of Hosu like a blade through smoke. He was hunting heroes. He had been hunting heroes for years, killing the ones he judged unworthy, the fakes, the posers, the men and women who wore the title hero because it came with a salary and a fan club, rather than because they believed in anything worth dying for. His body count was in the double digits. His ideology was simple. Only those who embodied the true spirit of heroism, self-sacrifice, conviction, the willingness to save others regardless of the cost, deserved to live. Everyone else was a fraud, and Stain was the blade that separated the genuine from the false. He had just downed Native, cut his tendons, licked the blood from the wound, activated his quirk to paralyze the hero, and was standing over the body in a narrow alley between 2 burning buildings when the air changed. Stain had survived long enough to trust the air. He'd been ambushed by heroes, by police, by bounty hunters who thought the reward on his head was worth the risk of collecting it. He had killed all of them, and the reason he had killed all of them was that his instincts were sharper than theirs. He felt threats before he saw them. He moved before the attack landed. He was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous combatants in Japan, a man who had been soaked in so much violence that his body had become a weapon even when his hands were empty. The threat he felt in that alley made every previous threat feel like a warm breeze. It came from behind him and above him, and somehow from inside the air itself. A presence, a weight, a signal that hit his nervous system like a bucket of ice water poured directly onto his brainstem. His hands tightened on his sword. His breathing changed. Every muscle in his body went taut, and the readiness that settled into his frame was the readiness of a man who knows, on some frequency below conscious thought, that the next few seconds will determine whether he continues to exist. "You fight with conviction," a voice said from the end of the alley, wrapped in the amber glow of the fires climbing the adjacent walls. I find that admirable in the way one admires a well-trained animal. Izuku stepped into the light of the fires. The flames from the adjacent buildings cast orange and amber across his suit, and his red eyes caught the firelight and threw it back like stained glass. Toga was on the roof above them, crouched at the edge, watching with bright eyes and a knife in each hand. Stain didn't hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury for people who had something to lose besides their life. and the hero killer had divested himself of everything except his sword and his conviction years ago. He lunged. The blade came in at an angle designed to open the throat, a strike he had practiced 10,000 times on training dummies and live targets, and the muscle memory of it was so ingrained that the execution was flawless. Izuku caught the blade in his bare hand, his fingers wrapped around the edge of the sword, the way fingers wrap around a handrail. Comfortably, with a grip that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with the fact that the blade could not cut him because his cells regenerated faster than steel could part them. The edge bit into his palm. Blood welled up. The wound sealed, while Stain was still processing the fact that his strike had been stopped by naked flesh. Stain's eyes, narrow, red, the eyes of someone who had looked at death so many times that the two of them were on familiar terms, widened. He pulled back. He struck again, a different angle, faster, the overhead chop of a man committing everything to a single blow. Izuku caught the blade again with the same hand in the same grip, and this time he held it long enough for Stain to see the wound close across his palm in real time. Skin flowing over steel. Blood retreating into the tissue, the damage being erased as if someone had pressed an undo button on reality. Stain pulled the blade free. He stepped back. He assessed. And then he did the thing that Stain always did. The thing that made his quirk the weapon it was. He licked the blade, his quirk, blood curdle, allowed him to paralyze anyone whose blood he ingested. It was the foundation of his fighting style. Cut the target, lick the blood, freeze them in place, and deliver the killing blow while they stood rigid and helpless. He had used it on dozens of heroes. It had never failed. The blood on the blade was Izuku's. The moment it touched Stain's tongue, the moment it entered his bloodstream through the mucous membranes of his mouth, the reaction began. It was immediate. It was total. And it was nothing Stain's quirk or his training or his iron will could have prepared him for. His blood curdle activated and then overloaded. The signal his quirk sent to his brain when processing ingested blood came back wrong, scrambled, containing information that a human nervous system was never designed to receive. 1,000 years of predatory memory. 1,000 years of cellular evolution, the biological fingerprint of a creature that had been eating human beings since before the samurai carried swords. All of it flooded into Stain's system through a few drops of blood on a sword blade, and his quirk, which had been the foundation of his power, became the delivery mechanism for his transformation. Stain collapsed. He went down hard, knees first, then hands, then his face against the asphalt. His sword clattered away, his body seized. The veins in his neck turned black and began to spread outward like roots growing at visible speed, and the sound he made was the sound of a man whose body was being rebuilt against his will. A sound that was too low for screaming and too raw for language, something primal and involuntary, and full of the particular horror of a consciousness watching itself be overwritten. Izuku stood over him with his hands in his pockets. "You kill for ideology," he said, looking down at the hero killer with an expression that held neither contempt nor admiration, just the steady, evaluating gaze of someone inspecting raw material. "I will give you the power to kill for me." Stain's back arched off the ground. His teeth sharpened. His muscles tore and regrew in the span of seconds, denser, faster, rebuilt according to specifications that the human genome had never contained. His eyes, already red, deepened to the plum shade that marked Izuku's own when the killing started. His quirk mutated. Blood curdle expanded from paralysis to total nervous system domination, the ability to seize the body of anyone whose blood he had tasted. His speed, already elite, tripled. His durability increased to the point where conventional weapons would bend against his skin. The transformation lasted longer than Toga's. 2 minutes and 17 seconds of a man's body being unmade and remade on the asphalt of a burning alley, while flames licked the walls on either side, and the screams from the hero battles 3 blocks away provided a soundtrack that nobody in that alley was listening to. When it ended, Stain lay face down on the ground. His breathing was steady. His body was new, and the mind inside that body, the mind that had belonged to the most ideologically committed killer in Japan, the man who burned for his beliefs with a purity that even the heroes he hunted respected, was no longer his own. He rose to his hands and knees, then to one knee. His head lifted, and his eyes, those new red-ringed eyes, found Izuku, the way a compass needle finds north. Inevitably, irresistibly, with the unwavering certainty of something that has been calibrated at the atomic level to point in a single direction. "What would you have me do?" Stain said, and his voice was changed, deeper, harder, carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before, as though the voice box that produced it had been rebuilt to resonate at frequencies that communicated obedience rather than defiance. "You are upper rank 1 of the 12 Kazuki," Izuku said, "the strongest of my moons. You will serve as the blade at the head of my formation, and you will cut whatever I tell you to cut." Stain bowed his head. "Yes, my king." The tragedy of it sat in the air like smoke. This was a man who had killed for something, who had believed in something so fiercely that he had sacrificed his name, his freedom, his humanity in pursuit of it. He had looked at the corruption of the hero system and decided, with the absolute certainty of a zealot, that the world could be fixed if the frauds were removed and only the genuine remained. That certainty, that burning singular fanatical purpose, was gone, replaced by a devotion that was indistinguishable from the original in its intensity but fundamentally different in its origin. Stain had chosen his ideology. His devotion to Izuku Midoriya was chosen for him, written into his cells, hardwired into the neural pathways of a brain that had been reformatted to serve a new master. The man who killed fake heroes now knelt for someone who had abandoned the concept of heroism entirely. If that irony burns, it should. It burned the air in that alley, and it burns the pages of this story, and it should burn you, because the thing that makes Izuku Midoriya terrifying is this. He didn't just take Stain's body. He took the one thing Stain valued above his own life, his conviction, and he replaced it with something colder, something older, something that had nothing to do with justice or reform or the purity of the heroic ideal, and everything to do with the ancient, absolute authority of a creature that views devotion as a resource to be harvested and installed. Toga dropped down from the roof and landed beside Stain with a grin that could have split her face in half. "Welcome to the family," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice, the warmth of someone who had been lonely for a long time and was glad for the company, even if the company was a mind-bound serial killer kneeling in an alley surrounded by fire. Izuku turned and walked away. Behind him, his first 2 moons fell into step, Toga on the left, Stain on the right, and the 3 of them moved through the burning streets of Hosu like figures walking through a house that was already theirs. The heroes fighting the Nomu 3 blocks away would never know how close they had been to something worse than the League of Villains. The students, Ida, who had come to Hosu to avenge his brother, Todoroki, who was there on an internship, the others who were scattered across the city in various states of readiness, would hear about the hero killer's disappearance in the morning news and assume he had gone underground. He had, just further underground than any of them could imagine. The weeks between Hosu and Kamino were a montage of acquisitions. Izuku moved through the underworld like a tide, rising, covering, consuming everything at the waterline. The Hasaikai's infrastructure gave him a foundation. Stain's reputation gave him a mythology. Toga's loyalty gave him eyes and ears in places he chose to send her, because efficiency demanded delegation even when omnipresence was nearly within reach. He built the 12 Kazuki. The process was consistent. Identify a powerful individual, villain, criminal, rogue quirk user, who had been failed or rejected or hunted by the Hero Society. Approach them. Offer them something the system never would. Convert them through blood injection. Watch them break and rebuild. Add them to the ranks. Upper rank 3 was a former underground fighter whose muscle augmentation quirk turned him into a walking siege engine once the demon blood refined it. Upper rank 4 was a woman from Osaka who could generate concussive force from her palms and who had been rejected from 3 hero programs for psychological instability. Ranks 5 through 12 were drawn from every shadow the Hero Society cast. Disgraced sidekicks, failed students, criminals whose quirks were too dangerous for polite society. Each one was converted. Each one knelt. Each one rose as something the world had never catalogued, a demon in the modern age, sun-immune, regenerating, bound to Izuku Midoriya at the level of blood and bone. The Hero Commission began to notice. It was the disappearances that tipped them off. Villain disappearances, which is the kind of thing you'd think heroes would celebrate, except that the villains weren't being caught. They were vanishing. Known criminals with established patterns and safe houses were simply ceasing to exist, and the vacuum they left behind was being filled by something organized, something efficient, something that operated with a coherence the underworld had never shown before. Analysts flagged it. Reports were filed. Meetings were held in rooms with frosted glass and coffee that nobody drank. The phrase "unknown consolidation event" appeared in 3 separate memos, and the people who wrote those memos felt a tightness in their chests that they attributed to stress, and that was, in reality, the early stages of institutional terror. All for One noticed first. Of course he did. The man, the thing, that called itself All for One had been alive longer than the Hero Society, longer than the concept of quirks, longer than the legal framework that separated heroes from villains. He had built the underworld. He had nurtured the League of Villains. He had broken All Might's body and spent years recovering from what All Might had done to him in return. And through all of it, through the centuries of manipulation and accumulation and the patient grinding work of being the world's oldest and most sophisticated predator, he had maintained the absolute certainty that he was the apex. He learned about Izuku Midoriya through Shigaraki, through the babbling, scratching, increasingly unhinged rants of a protege who had watched his Nomu melt and his invasion fail, and who was now exhibiting the behavioral patterns of a dog that had been kicked by something it couldn't identify. Shigaraki described the thing at the USJ. The suit, the fedora, the red eyes, the whips that grew from its body and moved faster than his mind could track, the Nomu reduced to sludge in seconds. He described it the way medieval peasants described dragons, with the breathless, terrified conviction of someone who had witnessed something that broke their model of the world. All for One listened. He processed. He activated intelligence networks that had been running since before Shigaraki was born and directed them to gather everything available on the entity calling itself Izuku Midoriya. What came back alarmed him. He would never admit that. All for One did not experience alarm the way normal people did. He experienced strategic recalculation, the emotionless adjustment of plans to accommodate new variables. But the recalculation was extensive. And the speed at which he moved from intelligence gathering to direct confrontation suggested to anyone who knew him well enough to read the signs that the thing in the suit had done something that a century of heroes and a lifetime of rivals had failed to accomplish. It had made All for One decide that waiting was more dangerous than acting. Camino Ward. The district had been a neutral zone for decades. A gray area between hero jurisdiction and villain territory, a place where information brokers operated and deals were made, and both sides pretended the other didn't exist. All for One had a facility there, hidden underneath a warehouse district, connected to the League of Villains through a network of tunnels and warp gates that Kurogiri maintained. Izuku came to Camino on a Thursday evening. He walked down the main commercial street at 7 o'clock when the shops were still open and the neon signs were buzzing and the sidewalks were full of people who had no idea they were sharing the street with the most dangerous organism on the planet. Toga walked behind him. Stain walked behind Toga. The other Kazuki were positioned around the district in a loose perimeter, on rooftops, in alleys, inside vehicles with tinted windows, a formation that communicated both readiness and indifference, the posture of an army that expected to win and was offended by the implication that it might fail. All for One met him in the street. He appeared through a warp gate, Kurogiri's work, the Black Mist villain serving as taxi service for his master the way he always had. All for One stepped through the portal and stood in the middle of the commercial street, and his presence emptied the block. Civilians scattered. Shop owners pulled their shutters down. The instinct was instant and universal. The air had gone wrong, and the smart move was to be somewhere else immediately. All for One was a tall man in a suit. His face was a ruin, scarred, eyeless, the aftermath of the battle with All Might, that had taken his original features and left something that looked like a melted mask. He compensated with quirks, infrared vision, air pressure sensing, neural mapping. He could see without eyes in ways that most sighted people couldn't match. He faced Izuku across 30 feet of empty sidewalk, and the two of them stood there for a moment that stretched. Two predators who had never shared a food chain, sizing each other up for the first time. Izuku Midoriya, all for one, said, and his voice was rich, cultured, the voice of a man who had centuries to practice sounding reasonable. The boy from Musutafu, the quirkless child who died in the harbor. I have followed your career with interest. You have followed it with fear, Izuku said. The distinction matters. All for one smiled. The scar tissue that served as his face shifted into something that approximated amusement. I have gathered many quirks over a long life, young man. I have broken all might. I have shaped the underworld into my image for over a century. I say this so that you understand the scale of what you are facing. I understand the scale, Izuku said. You are the one who does not. You have gathered a fascinating power, young Midoriya. Give it to me. The words hung in the air. All for one's tone was still the tone of a man offering a deal, an experienced negotiator who believed that every confrontation was, at its foundation, a transaction. He extended his hand. The gesture was almost paternal. Izuku did not move. All for one attacked. The first air cannon hit Izuku's chest and sent him backward 6 feet. The shockwave was enormous. A concentrated blast of compressed air that could level a building and had done so on numerous occasions. The street cracked under the impact. Windows in a 3-block radius blew out. Car alarms triggered in cascading waves of electronic screaming. Izuku's dress shirt was torn open by the blast. The skin underneath, pale, smooth, unmarked, showed the impact point. A circular bruise that was already fading, the cells beneath regenerating the damaged tissue in real time. He adjusted his cufflinks. He looked down at his torn shirt, then back at All for One, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who has just been told a joke that they find genuinely, honestly funny. He laughed. It was a cold sound. Unhurried. The laugh of a creature that finds the situation amusing and sees nothing on the immediate horizon worth worrying about. It echoed off the building facades and settled into the ears of the civilians who were watching from behind cars and inside shops, and it made them cold. Because laughter in response to an attack that could level a building is the kind of thing that rewrites your understanding of what you're dealing with. Does my complexion look terrible to you? Izuku said, stepping forward, the last of the bruise vanishing from his chest. Do I look like I'm close to death? All for One fired again. Rivet stabs, long, black, spike-like protrusions that launched from his fingertips at hypersonic speed, designed to pierce, to pin, to impale targets at range. 4 of them hit Izuku simultaneously. 2 in the chest, 1 in the throat, 1 through his left eye. He kept walking. The rivets pushed through his body and out the other side, and the exit wounds closed before the entrance wounds finished sealing. And by the time the projectiles clattered on the pavement behind him, his body was whole, and his left eye had regrown in its socket. Iris, pupil, lens, retinal tissue, all of it reformed in the time it took All for One to process that his attack had accomplished nothing. Izuku entered his combat form. The transformation was fast and total and terrible. His suit jacket tore apart as his torso expanded. New mass growing from his back and shoulders, the flesh splitting along lines that opened into mouths. Dozens of them. Mouths lined with fangs stretched across his ribcage, his abdomen, his shoulder blades, each one opening and closing independently, each one ringed with teeth that glistened with the toxic saliva that could break down organic matter on contact. From his spine, the tendrils erupted again, longer than before, thicker, barbed with hooks and blades that rotated and extended and retracted in patterns that were too fast and too complex for a human mind to track. His eyes, both of them, blazed crimson. His face, still recognizably Izuku Midoriya's face, wore the same composed expression it had worn since the beginning of the fight, and that was the most disturbing part. The body was a nightmare, and the face was attending a dinner party. All for One threw everything, air cannons, rivet stabs, spring-like limbs that extended his reach, kinetic booster that amplified his striking power, impact recoil that reflected force. He cycled through his stolen quirks at a rate that would have overwhelmed any hero in the world, including All Might, including Endeavor, including the entire top 10 working in concert. The street shook. Buildings cracked. A helicopter that had been covering Camino Ward for a news station veered away hard as the shock waves reached its altitude, and the cameraman on board kept filming because that was his job. Every cell in his body was telling him that the thing he was filming should remain unseen. Izuku moved through the assault the way a river moves through a canyon, around obstacles, over barriers, through gaps, shaping itself to the terrain without being shaped by it. The attacks hit him. Every single one of them hit him. Air cannons blew chunks from his torso that regrew before the air finished rushing past. Rivet stabs pierced him and were expelled. The impact recoil quirk reflected force back at him, and his body absorbed the reflected force and metabolized it as fuel. He was getting closer. 20 feet, 15, 10. Each step crushed the broken pavement under his weight. The additional mass from his combat form, making him heavier than a car, his body a composite of original tissue, absorbed biological material, and the 1,000-year-old cellular template of a creature that had spent its entire existence evolving toward the singular purpose of being impossible to kill, all for one reached for him, the signature ability. The power that had defined All for One for centuries. The ability to steal quirks, to reach into another being's body through physical contact and rip out the genetic factor that made them powerful. He had stolen hundreds of abilities this way. Thousands, possibly. It was the tool that had made him the ruler of the underworld, the counterbalance to One for All, the nightmare that kept the Hero Commission's classified files stained with coffee rings from all-night strategy sessions. His hand made contact with Izuku's shoulder. The stealing function activated. All for One reached into the cellular structure of Izuku's body, searching for a quirk factor to extract, a genetic sequence to seize, a power to pull from the boy the way he'd pulled power from so many others. He found Muzan. 1,000 years of accumulated existence flooded through the contact point. It was everything, every sensation, every memory, every molecule of the cold, absolute, predatory will that had driven Muzan Kibutsuji across 10 centuries of shadow and hunger and evolution. It hit All for One's consciousness like a tsunami hits a seawall, totally, overwhelmingly, with the kind of force that makes the concept of resistance feel childish. All for One's mental defenses cracked. These were defenses that had been built over a century and a half. Defenses that had repelled telepaths, psychic quirk users, neural hackers, and every form of mental intrusion the quirk-powered world had ever produced. They were the innermost armor of a man who had survived longer than most nations, and they cracked in less than a second against the weight of a soul that was older and heavier and infinitely more committed to its own supremacy than anything All for One had ever encountered. He yanked his hand back. The motion was involuntary, his body overriding his mind, his nervous system slamming the emergency exit before his conscious thoughts could catch up. He staggered. For the first time in decades, All for One staggered on his feet, and the civilians who saw it, the ones still watching from behind cars and through windows, the cameraman in the helicopter, the news anchors who were broadcasting this live to every screen in Japan, saw the most powerful villain in the country stumble like a man who had touched a furnace, and learned for the first time in a very long life that there were still things in this world that could burn him. Izuku's tendrils struck. The whips of bladed flesh closed around All for One's right arm, 3 of them, wrapping, tightening, the barbed edges sinking into the flesh and severing it at the shoulder with a wet structural sound that was picked up by the helicopter's directional microphone and broadcast to 4 million viewers in real time. Izuku caught the severed arm in one hand. He raised it to his mouth. The mouths across his torso opened simultaneously, and the arm and the quirks stored inside it, the catalog of stolen abilities that All for One had spent a century collecting, was consumed in a single bite that involved jaws and teeth from 6 different points on Izuku's body working in concert. The abilities flooded into him. He absorbed them the way a sponge absorbs water. Instantly, completely, with the effortless totality of a system designed to integrate foreign biological material. He could feel the stolen quirks settling into his cellular architecture, being cataloged, being filed, being made available for use at his discretion. Dozens of them. Air cannon, rivet stab, spring-like limbs, and others. Minor abilities, sensory enhancements, the biological detritus of 100 stolen lives, all of them now belonging to Izuku Midoriya. You are a relic, all for one, Izuku said, and his voice was undistorted despite the combat form, carrying across the ruined street with the same measured tone he'd used to introduce himself. I am the future. All for One stood in the ruins of the street with one arm, his suit destroyed, his face, his already ruined face, twisted into an expression that mixed pain with something unfamiliar. It took the helicopter cameraman, zooming in from 200 feet, a moment to identify the expression. When he did, he said a word into his headset that his producer would later confirm hearing. He's afraid. All for One activated a warp quirk. A portal opened behind him, swirling, ringed in black mist, leading to a location that only he knew. He stepped backward into it. He stepped backward, because turning his back on the thing standing in the middle of Camino Ward was something his body refused to do, and the part of All for One that was still an animal understood that presenting his spine to this predator was the last thing the animal would ever do. The portal closed. All for One was gone. The street held nothing except settling rubble and the distant rotation of the helicopter's blades. Izuku stood in the crater, his combat form had made in the asphalt, and the mouths across his body closed one by one, and the tendrils retracted into his back, and the additional mass pulled inward until he was standing there in his human shape, shirtless, his suit pants torn at the knees, his white fedora somehow still on his head because some things refused to be dislodged by anything as pedestrian as the fight of the century. Toga was behind him, kneeling. Her head bowed, her blonde hair hanging forward, her body language communicating devotion in a posture that was as natural to her as breathing, because it was, at this point, the same thing. Stain was behind Toga, kneeling, his sword across his thighs, his red eyes forward, his face carrying nothing except the focused, unquestioning readiness of a weapon waiting to be aimed. The other Kazuki materialized from their positions around the district. They emerged from rooftops and alleys and vehicles, and they knelt in a loose formation behind their two superiors, 12 figures, each one a former human being who had been rewritten at the cellular level to serve the thing standing at the center of the formation, each one radiating the same impossible wrongness that made civilians physically ill and made heroes reach for weapons they knew wouldn't work. The helicopter circled. The camera zoomed in. Izuku looked up. He found the lens the way a spotlight finds a stage. Instant, certain, without searching. He looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting to every screen in Japan, and the expression on his face was the expression that would end up on the cover of every newspaper, every news magazine, every hastily assembled government briefing packet for the next 6 months. It was an expression empty of anything the viewer could use. Anger, motivation, ideology, all absent, all irrelevant. There was only the steady, amber-green gaze of something that had just eaten a piece of the most powerful villain in the country and was looking at the rest of the world the way a diner looks at a menu that still has several pages left. I am a perfect creature that is infinitely close to perfection, Izuku said, and the helicopter microphone caught every syllable, and the words traveled through broadcast towers and cable networks and streaming platforms and into the ears of a nation that had spent 2 centuries believing it understood power. The words hit the broadcast networks and kept traveling. Within 90 seconds, the Camino footage was on every major streaming platform. Within 3 minutes, it had been downloaded 400,000 times, clipped, screenshotted, and spread across social media with the frantic energy of a species that had been shown something it could neither explain nor ignore. Some called it a villain's manifesto. Some called it the opening of a war. An alarming number of people, more than the government would ever admit to counting, called it the truth. In the Hero Commission's central headquarters in Tokyo, a building that sat behind 3 security checkpoints and a quirk-dampening perimeter, the emergency session began 14 minutes after the Camino footage aired. 23 officials filed into a conference room designed for 12, and the overflow stood against the walls with tablets in their hands, and the particular expression of people who have been given information their training prepared them for. The chairwoman, a sharp-faced woman in her 60s, who had survived 4 changes in government and 2 villain crises that would have ended lesser bureaucrats, stood at the head of the table and played the Camino footage on the wall screen without commentary. She let the room watch the full sequence: the combat form, the tendrils, the severing of all for one's arm, the consumption, the Kazuki kneeling, the declaration. When the clip ended, she played it again. When it ended the second time, she turned off the screen and looked at the people in the room and said one sentence: "Tell me what we're dealing with." The silence that followed lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds of a room full of the most powerful bureaucrats in Japanese heroics staring at each other and discovering together that none of them had an answer. The analyst who finally spoke was a young man with glasses and a voice that shook despite his efforts to steady it. He said the words that would appear in the classified briefing document distributed to every top-ranked hero in the country by morning. "We don't know." 2 floors above the conference room, in an office the public didn't know existed, a direct line to the Prime Minister's residence was ringing. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff answered, listened for 40 seconds, and then interrupted the Prime Minister's dinner with 4 words that historians would later identify as the first official acknowledgement at the highest level of Japanese government that the hero system had failed. "We have a problem." The Prime Minister released a statement at 11:47 p.m. It was 6 paragraphs of language designed to communicate authority without committing to action, the rhetorical equivalent of standing in a burning building and discussing the fire code. He used the words unprecedented threat. He used the words full confidence in our hero agencies. He used the words urge the public to remain inside. He did everything except name the thing he was talking about, because naming it would have required understanding it, and understanding it would have required admitting that the system he had spent his career administering was built on a foundation that had just been kicked out from under it. Across the country, in dorm rooms and apartments, and the teacher housing attached to UA High School, the students of Class 1A watched the footage on their phones. Kirishima saw it first. He had been scrolling through a hero fan forum when the clip autoplayed in his feed, and the sound he made brought Kaminari and Sero running from the common room. Within 10 minutes, every student in the dormitory was awake and staring at a screen. Uraraka watched with her hand over her mouth. Ida watched standing up, because sitting felt wrong for something this heavy. Yaoyorozu watched twice, paused the clip on the frame where the tendrils were fully extended, and began writing notes with a hand that trembled enough to make her handwriting illegible for the first time in her life. Asui watched from the corner of the common room with her knees drawn to her chest, her wide eyes unblinking, her tongue pressed against her lower lip in the instinctive compression reflex her quirk produced when her body recognized danger it could neither fight nor flee. Todoroki watched once in his room, alone. He recognized the implications faster than his classmates. He was the son of the number 2 hero, and the thing in the footage had just demonstrated that every ranking the Hero Society published was irrelevant. He set his phone face down on his desk and sat with his hands in his lap, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone solving an equation that only produces negative sums. Bakugo watched alone. He locked his door, something he never did, and played the clip 7 times. He played it on mute after the 3rd viewing because the sound of Izuku's voice, amplified through the helicopter's broadcast microphone, was doing something to his chest that he refused to give a name. He paused on the face. The freckles were still there. The jawline was the same. The eyes were wrong. Red, slitted, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the 14-year-old kid Bakugo remembered pushing into hallway walls. But the face was the face he had grown up beside, and the disconnect between what he remembered and what he was seeing created a pressure in his skull that felt like his brain was trying to reject a thought it could never afford to accept. He turned off his phone. He sat on the edge of his bed in the half-light from the window, and his hands, the hands that could generate explosions powerful enough to crater concrete, hung between his knees. And they were still, Izuku Midoriya, meanwhile, was eating. He sat at a table in a restaurant in a district adjacent to Kamino, the kind of upscale establishment that stayed open late for the neighborhood's wealthier residents and closed its blinds when the sounds of destruction traveled from a few blocks away. The owner had fled. The staff had fled. The kitchen was empty, except for the food that had been in mid-preparation when the evacuation order hit, and Toga had finished cooking it with the cheerful efficiency of someone who viewed looting an abandoned restaurant as a minor adventure rather than a crime. The food was irrelevant to his body. His cells extracted energy from consumption at a level so far below the molecular that conventional nutrition was a formality. He could sustain himself on organic matter of any kind, and the gourmet presentation of the dishes Toga set before him was an aesthetic choice rather than a dietary requirement. He ate because the act of eating at a table with a napkin in his lap and a glass of water beside his plate communicated something to the part of his mind that was still, in some residual and increasingly peripheral way, Izuku Midoriya. It communicated normalcy. He found the performance interesting. Toga sat across from him, cross-legged in her chair, eating with her fingers, because manners were a system she had opted out of long before the demon blood rewired her cells. She was watching him with the bright, attentive adoration of a creature whose entire emotional architecture had been rebuilt around a single point of focus, and the smile on her face was the same one she had worn since the warehouse, permanent, luminous, and completely genuine in a way that made it worse than any mask. "You were beautiful out there," she said, licking sauce from her thumb. "The way you took his arm, I almost screamed." Izuku set down his chopsticks. "We have work." He closed his eyes. Inside his body, inside the cellular library that had been accumulating data since the alley behind the train station, the catalog of stolen quirks from All for One's severed arm was still integrating. He could feel them settling into his architecture the way new software settles into a system after installation. Processes running in the background, capabilities coming online one by one, each absorbed ability finding its place in a framework that had been designed across 1,000 years of evolution to accept exactly this kind of input. Air cannon was there, rivet stab, spring-like limbs, kinetic booster, and dozens of others, minor abilities, sensory modifications, the biological debris of 100 lives stolen by a thief who had just been robbed. He opened his eyes. They were amber green, the default setting, the human mask, the version of his appearance that could walk through a crowd without triggering the prey recognition response that his true eyes activated in every mammalian brain within visual range. "Summon the others," he said. Toga pulled a phone from her belt, a burner, untraceable, one of a rotating series she maintained because digital hygiene was the kind of operational detail she had taken to with the enthusiasm of a convert. She sent 12 messages. 12 locations received them. 12 converted organisms, each one a former human being whose DNA had been rewritten around the template of a 1,000-year-old predator, began moving toward a meeting point that Izuku had selected 6 weeks before Kamino, because the timeline of his campaign extended further back than the Hero Commission would ever reconstruct. They assembled in the basement of a building the Hasaikai had owned, a warehouse on the Yokohama waterfront, converted into a meeting space with the industrial austerity of a room that existed for purpose rather than impression. Concrete floors, bare walls, fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency only enhanced hearing could detect. The 12 Kazuki knelt in 2 rows of 6. Their postures were identical, right knee down, left knee up, heads bowed, hands on thighs. The uniformity was instinctive rather than rehearsed, coded into their rewritten neurology the way breathing was coded into their lungs. They knelt because their cells told them to kneel, and the command came from the same blood that pumped through their rebuilt hearts. Izuku stood at the front of the room. His suit was new, acquired in the hour between the restaurant and this meeting, from a tailor's shop in Minato whose owner had left the inventory unsecured during the Kamino evacuation. Same cut, same quality. Crisp white shirt, white fedora, charcoal 3-piece. The outfit was a statement. He had fought the most powerful villain in the world and been inconvenienced enough to need a new shirt. He looked at his Kazuki. Toga, upper rank 2, at the left end of the front row, her golden red eyes bright and fixed on him. Stain, upper rank 1, at the right end, his expression carrying nothing except readiness, the focused blankness of a weapon waiting for direction. Between them and behind them, the remaining 10. The former underground fighter, the concussive force woman from Osaka, the disgraced sidekicks and failed students and criminals, whose quirks had been too dangerous for a society that preferred to label danger rather than employ it. Each one stronger than any pro-hero below the top 5. Each one bound to Izuku at a level where disobedience was a concept their neural pathways could never form. "The Hero Commission is assembling a response," Izuku said. His voice filled the room without effort. It carried the way a stone drops through water, with gravity and weight and the absolute certainty of arrival. They will position their strongest heroes at key points. They will mobilize their intelligence apparatus. They will hold press conferences and issue statements and reassure the public that the system they built is strong enough to protect them. He paused. The fluorescent light above him hummed. "The system they built is a house made of paper and good intentions. You are going to walk through every wall." He assigned targets. The assignments were given in the same measured tone he used for everything, a tone that communicated expectation rather than request, the voice of someone distributing inevitabilities. Ranks 4 through 12 received their deployment cities and operational parameters. Rank 3, the siege engine fighter, whose augmented muscles could tear through reinforced structures the way a hand tears through wet cardboard, received a specific target: the Hero Commission's secondary communications hub in Osaka, the backup system they would activate when the primary went down. Toga received her assignment with a smile that widened until it threatened the structural integrity of her face. Stain received his with the single nod of a blade being told where to fall. "You move in 48 hours, Izuku said. You move together, you move fast, and when you are finished, the infrastructure that allows this society to pretend it is safe will be rubble." He looked at the 24 eyes looking back at him. 12 pairs, 12 creatures, 12 bricks of an architecture he had spent 14 months designing, and the last 24 hours revealing to a world that still didn't understand what it was seeing. He felt their devotion the way a conductor feels an orchestra, through the vibration, through the tension, through the readiness of instruments that existed to play the music he wrote. "My word is absolute," Izuku said, and the 4 words fell into the room like stones into a well, and the 12 Kazuki lowered their heads in unison, and the sound they made was the sound of breath being released. 12 exhalations that were half acknowledgement and half prayer. The biological response of creatures receiving a command from the thing that owned their blood. He left the room. Toga rose and followed, 2 steps behind, her knives already back in her hands because the transition between waiting and readiness was, for Toga, the distance between one heartbeat and the next. Stain rose and followed Toga, his sword across his back, his red-ringed eyes forward. Behind them, in the basement, the remaining Kazuki began to move. 48 hours later, the #1 hero in active service went hunting for a god and found one. Enji Todoroki had been the #2 hero for 23 years, and every one of those years had tasted like ash in his mouth. He had spent his career in All Might's shadow, a man whose fire burned at temperatures that could melt steel and reshape concrete, permanently ranked behind a smiling blonde giant who punched harder than physics should allow and made it look effortless. He had married for quirk genetics. He had broken his family. He had committed every sin a man can commit in pursuit of a number, and the number had always been 2. After Camino, after All Might's public retirement, after the footage showed the world that All for One was injured and running, the ranking shifted. Endeavor became #1 by default, and the taste of it was worse than ash. He was first because the man above him had been emptied, and the monster above that man had been wounded by something Endeavor couldn't name. The title was a hand-me-down. He wore it like a suit that didn't fit. When the Hero Commission briefed him on the Demon King, the name the analysts had settled on, because Izuku Midoriya, sounded too much like someone's child, and the dissonance made the briefings harder to deliver. Endeavor listened with his arms folded and his jaw set, and the particular intensity of a man who has been offered a chance to make his title mean something. The briefing was incomplete. The analysts admitted this with the uncomfortable transparency of people who understood that sending incomplete intelligence to a combat asset was a liability, and who had nothing better to give. Endeavor took the briefing. He assembled a team, 4 sidekicks, 2 tactical analysts, a communications officer who would maintain a live feed to the Hero Commission's command center. He reviewed the known capabilities: regeneration, shapeshifting, bioweapon generation, consumed quirk arsenal. He mapped the last confirmed movement pattern. He found a convergence point, a district in Shizuoka where 3 separate surveillance systems had flagged anomalous movement consistent with the Demon King's operational profile. He went to Shizuoka on a Thursday morning, and the weather was clear, and the streets were emptier than they should have been because the evacuation advisories that now accompanied any suspected Demon King sighting had turned entire neighborhoods into ghost towns. His sidekicks fanned out in a support formation, 2 blocks wide, interlocking fields of engagement, the kind of tactical spacing designed to provide coverage against a conventional threat. The threat was standing in the middle of a commercial intersection, alone, wearing his white fedora and a suit that looked like it had been pressed 10 minutes ago. His hands were in his pockets. His posture was the posture of someone waiting for a bus, relaxed, patient, existing in the moment with the comfortable certainty of someone who has nothing to fear from anything the moment might contain. Endeavor landed in the intersection 40 feet from Izuku. His flames were already running. Hellflame wreathing his body in a corona of orange and white fire that heated the air around him to the point where the asphalt under his feet began to soften. He was an impressive sight. The #1 hero in full combat deployment, fire streaming from every surface, his turquoise eyes locked on his target with the focus of a man who intended to end this engagement with a body on the ground. His sidekicks took flanking positions. The communications officer established the live feed. 3 civilian phones and a news drone that had been following the evacuation perimeter were already recording. Izuku Midoriya, Endeavor said, and his voice boomed through the intersection with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. You are under arrest for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, assault on pro-heroes, and destruction of property. Stand down. Izuku looked at him the way a man looks at a campfire, aware of its heat, respectful of its element, entirely unconcerned about its ability to do meaningful harm. He took one hand from his pocket and adjusted the brim of his fedora, and the gesture was so unhurried and so indifferent to the wall of fire standing 40 feet away that one of Endeavor's sidekicks, a woman with a reinforcement quirk who had been in hero work for 11 years, felt her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. You are the #1 hero, Izuku said, by default. Endeavor attacked. He led with a concentrated jet of hellflame, a column of fire compressed to a beam narrower than a man's torso and hotter than the surface of a welding arc. The beam crossed the 40-foot gap in less than a second and hit Izuku's chest at the approximate center of mass. The impact was visible from 3 blocks away, a flash of white-hot combustion, the air itself detonating around the contact point, the sound arriving a fraction of a second after the light, because Endeavor's fire moved faster than the pressure wave it generated. Izuku burned. His suit jacket ignited and turned to ash in the first half-second. The shirt beneath followed. His skin, the pale, marble-smooth surface that had healed from bullets and stone spikes and the fists of engineered biological weapons, blackened and cracked and peeled away from the muscle tissue underneath, and for a span of 3 seconds that Endeavor would remember for the rest of his life, the fire did what fire does to organic matter. It consumed it. Then the cells closed. The regeneration started at the edges of the burn and moved inward at a speed that made Endeavor's fire look slow. New skin grew over charred muscle. New muscle grew over scorched bone. The damage that Hellflame had inflicted, damage that would have killed any living thing in the country, damage that had ended villains with regeneration, quirks whose healing factor was a fraction of what Izuku carried, was undone while the fire was still burning. The flames licked across skin that was already new, already smooth, already pale, and the fire found nothing left to destroy because destruction and reconstruction were happening simultaneously, and reconstruction was winning by a margin so vast that the competition was embarrassing. Izuku stood in the center of the flame column, shirtless, his skin unmarked, his fedora gone, claimed by the initial blast, the first casualty of the fight, and the only one Izuku would acknowledge later with anything resembling annoyance. He looked down at his bare chest, at the smooth expanse of skin that had been charcoal 3 seconds ago, and then he looked up at Endeavor. And the expression on his face was the expression from Camino, the one that had already become the most screenshotted image in the country. "Does my complexion look terrible to you?" Izuku said. "Do I look like I'm close to death?" Endeavor threw everything, give him credit for this. The man did what heroes are supposed to do. He fought. He fought with the full output of a quirk that had been bred, trained, and refined across a lifetime of obsessive pursuit of a single goal, being the strongest. He launched concentrated punches wreathed in compressed flame that hit with the combined force of kinetic impact and thermal detonation. He deployed his maximum output technique, a sustained wave of fire that engulfed 3 city blocks and turned the intersection into a landscape that looked like the surface of a star. He fought from the air, from the ground, from angles that demonstrated a tactical sophistication the public rarely got to see, because Endeavor's public image was rage and fire. But his actual combat method was the product of decades of study and adaptation. He hit Izuku 17 times. Each hit burned flesh from bone. Each hit was healed before the next one landed. The pattern was the same as every other fight Izuku had walked through since the Hasaikai compound: damage, regeneration, advance. Endeavor was fighting a brush fire that kept reigniting from roots deeper than his flames could reach. And every second of the fight cost him stamina, while costing Izuku nothing that his body couldn't replace between heartbeats. 3 minutes and 40 seconds in, Endeavor's output began to drop. His flames, which had been white hot at the start, shifted to orange. His breathing changed, the deep, rhythmic pull of a trained fighter giving way to the ragged gasps of a body approaching its thermal limit. His quirk generated heat by converting body fat and caloric reserves into combustion fuel, and the reserves were finite. He had burned through more energy in 3 minutes of fighting Izuku Midoriya than he had burned in any single engagement in his 23-year career. And the return on that expenditure was 0 visible damage on a target that looked like it had just stepped out of a fitting room. Izuku closed the distance. He moved the way he had moved against Chisaki, against All for One, with a speed that existed in the gap between there and here, a displacement of mass that covered 30 feet in a time frame the human eye registered as a single frame of visual data. One moment, he was standing in the scorched intersection. The next, his hand was around Endeavor's throat, and the flames wreathing Endeavor's body, the hell flame that burned at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees, were licking across Izuku's bare skin and accomplishing nothing except making his regeneration cycle slightly faster. Because heat was energy and energy was fuel, and his cells were built to metabolize everything the environment offered, Endeavor's hands gripped Izuku's forearm. He poured fire directly into the flesh, point-blank hellflame, every remaining watt of thermal energy his body could produce, channeled through his palms and into the arm holding him. The skin blackened, the muscle charred, the bone cracked from thermal stress, the arm healed around his hands. The new tissue formed over Endeavor's fingers, sealing them inside a grip that was regenerating faster than the fire could damage it, and Endeavor felt the terrible, intimate sensation of his enemy's body growing around his own hands, like a living restraint that could never be burned away because burning it made it grow back thicker. "You spent your life chasing a number," Izuku said. He was close enough that Endeavor could see the individual lashes around his red eyes, could see the texture of skin that kept rewriting itself across cheekbones that hadn't changed since the boy was 14. "You sacrificed your family for a ranking. You built everything you are around the idea of being first, and you still don't understand what first looks like." The tendrils emerged. They came from Izuku's back, 4 of them, the bladed, serrated extensions of weaponized flesh that uncoiled from his spine, like the legs of something emerging from a coon. They moved with the liquid, insectile speed that had torn through the Hasaikai's soldiers and dismembered the Nomu at the USJ, and they wrapped around Endeavor's body, his arms, his torso, his legs, and began to tighten. Endeavor roared. The sound was enormous, the full-throated scream of a man whose pride and whose body were being crushed simultaneously, and the fire that erupted from him in response was a detonation, a final volcanic burst that blew out windows in a 6-block radius and sent the news drone spinning sideways hard enough to crack its stabilizer gimbal. The flame engulfed Izuku completely. For 1 second, one single, glorious, terrible second, Endeavor burned at a temperature that exceeded anything he had ever produced, a peak output that scorched the atmosphere and left the intersection glazed with a coating of fused silicate glass. The tendrils held when the fire died, because it had to die, because Endeavor had reached the absolute bottom of his reserves, and the flame was running on fumes and willpower, and neither of those was a renewable resource. Izuku was still there, burned and healed, and burned and healed, the cycle running so fast that his skin flickered between charred and smooth like a strobe light made of flesh, and through it all his expression remained the same, composed, present, and carrying the faint amusement of someone who has been impressed enough to notice the effort without being threatened enough to respect it. The tendrils tightened. The sound Endeavor made was brief. The cameras caught it. The civilian phones, the damaged news drone that was still transmitting, the body cameras on the sidekicks who were standing at the edge of the engagement zone with weapons drawn, and the full body understanding that using those weapons would accomplish nothing except drawing the thing's attention. The sound was the compression of a man's ribcage past the point where it could maintain the shape of a man's ribcage. And it was followed by the series of structural failures that occur when a human body is subjected to forces it was never built to withstand. Endeavor. Enji Todoroki, the #1 hero, the man who burned, died in the intersection in Shizuoka at 10:14 a.m. on a morning with a clear sky and good visibility, and the footage was clean enough that the analysts who reviewed it later could count the individual teeth on the tendrils that killed him. Izuku released the body. It fell to the glazed asphalt with a sound that the microphones captured, and the broadcast network spent 3 days debating whether to include in their reporting before the decision became irrelevant, because every unedited version was already online. He picked up his fedora. It was lying in the rubble 20 feet away, singed but intact, because the hat was either remarkably well constructed or operating under the protection of something the universe had decided wasn't worth arguing with. He placed it on his head. He adjusted the brim. He turned and walked out of the intersection, stepping over the glazed ground with the stride of someone leaving a room where the meeting has concluded and the outcome was never in question. The footage of Endeavor's death reached the internet in under a minute. It reached the Hero Commission in under 2. It reached Todoroki Shoto's phone in under 3, and reflected off the face of a boy whose father had been many things. A hero, a tyrant, a man consumed by a hunger that ate everything around it, and was now nothing except footage that other people would watch and re-watch until the image lost its power to shock, which would take longer than usual because the image was the kind that reshapes the viewer's understanding of what the word power actually means. The #1 hero was dead. The ranking system's highest-ranked active combatant had been killed on camera in under 4 minutes by an opponent who had emerged from the fight without a shirt and without a scratch, and with the bearing of someone who had been mildly inconvenienced by the weather. The Hero Commission issued a classified directive within the hour. All top-ranked heroes were to stand down from direct engagement with the Demon King, pending the development of a coordinated strategy. The coordinated strategy never materialized because the thing it was being developed to fight moved faster than committees. Tomura Shigaraki heard about Endeavor's death through Spinner, who heard it on the radio in the safe house kitchen while making breakfast for a league of villains that was rapidly discovering it had nothing left to be a league about. The information landed on Shigaraki like another stone on a pile that was already crushing him. The creature from the USJ, the boy in the fedora, the thing that had melted his Nomu and dismissed him like a background character in his own story, was dismantling everything. Heroes, villains, the entire power structure that Shigaraki had spent years planning to topple. Someone else was toppling it first, faster, and with a style that made Shigaraki's hand-covered aesthetic look like a costume party, he was scratching his neck raw. The skin was red and peeling and spotted with blood where his fingernails had broken through, and the compulsive, frantic energy of the scratching was the physical expression of a mind that was eating itself. The safe house, a condemned apartment building in a district of Yokohama that smelled like mildew and desperation, held the remaining core of the League. Dabi, leaning against a wall with his arms folded and his stapled skin pulling at the corners of his mouth in a permanent grimace. Twice, talking to himself in the corner, his mask askew, the fracture in his psyche widening with every crisis the League failed to navigate. Compress, sitting in a chair with the stillness of a man conserving energy because he understood, with the clarity of a professional, that energy was the only resource he had left. Spinner, in the kitchen, holding a spatula and looking lost. "We should hit something," Shigaraki said. He was pacing. 4 steps one direction, 4 steps back. The hand on his face, the one he called father, was slipping. "We need to make a statement, something big, something that reminds everyone we're here. We're the ones who attacked the USJ, we're the ones with the plan. This kid, he's just what?" Dabi said from his wall. His turquoise eyes, Todoroki eyes, though nobody in the room except Dabi knew that and he'd sooner burn than say it, were flat and unimpressed and focused on Shigaraki with the particular contempt reserved for leaders who have failed to lead. He ate All for One's arm on live television. He killed the #1 hero this morning. What's your plan, boss? Scratch him to death? Shigaraki stopped pacing. His red eyes, visible above the hand, wide and manic, and carrying the glassy sheen of someone whose grip on rational thought was being maintained by willpower alone, fixed on Dabi with a hatred that was only partially directed at the speaker. The rest was directed inward, at the part of himself that knew Dabi was right, and was screaming it in a voice Shigaraki couldn't silence. "When Sensei comes back," Shigaraki started. "Sensei is hiding," Dabi said. "Sensei lost an arm and ran. Your invincible mentor got his limb bitten off by a teenager and teleported away like a magic trick, and you're still waiting for him to fix this? Wake up." The door came off its hinges. It happened without warning and without theater. The reinforced steel door of the safe house simply detached from its frame and fell inward, flat, slamming against the floor with a boom that shook dust from the ceiling and sent foing, twice, scrambling backward into the wall. Behind the space where the door had been, framed by the hallway's fluorescent lighting like a figure stepping out of a portrait, stood a boy in a white fedora with his hands in his pockets and his red eyes already cataloging every person in the room. Toga stepped through behind him, her knives catching the light, her smile the brightest thing in the building. Stain entered last, his sword drawn, his eyes scanning the corners with the reflexive assessment of someone whose body was built for killing and whose mind was built to serve. The League froze. Spinner dropped the spatula. Compress stood from his chair with slow, measured care, his hands raised to the level of his chest. The universal gesture of someone who has made a decision about survival that supersedes every other consideration. Twice pressed himself flat against the wall, his mask half off, his 2 voices arguing in overlapping fragments that neither of them could finish. Dabi pushed off the wall. Blue fire flickered at his fingertips, a reflexive response, the body arming itself before the mind had decided whether to fight or flee. His stapled skin pulled tight across his jawline, and the expression under the patchwork was the expression of a man doing math with stakes and probabilities and arriving at a sum he didn't like. Shigaraki launched himself forward. He moved fast, faster than most people expected from a thin man whose physical conditioning took a backseat to his quirk. And his right hand extended in a 5-finger spread, palm forward, every digit aimed at Izuku's chest. Decay. The power that turned everything it touched to dust. The power that had killed heroes, destroyed buildings, and served as the cornerstone of every threat Shigaraki had ever made. All 5 fingers made contact with Izuku's suit jacket, pressing into the fabric above his sternum, and the quirk activated. The jacket disintegrated at the contact point. The shirt beneath followed. Shigaraki's fingers touched skin, the pale, smooth, impossibly dense surface of Izuku Midoriya's chest, and decay poured into it with the full power of a quirk that had been erasing matter since its user was a child. The skin under Shigaraki's fingers turned gray. It cracked. Tiny fissures radiated from the contact point, spreading outward in a pattern that Shigaraki recognized because he had seen it 1,000 times. The beginning of total disintegration. The moment when the target's molecular structure began to give way, and the collapse cascaded through the entire body. The fissures stopped. They stopped because the cells at the edge of the disintegration zone were regenerating. They were growing back. New cells emerging from the boundary between damaged and undamaged tissue, and pushing forward, filling the cracks, replacing the gray with pink, and then with white, and the speed of the regeneration was faster than the speed of the decay, and the wave of destruction that should have erased Izuku Midoriya from the atomic level up was being beaten back the way a tide is beaten back by a seawall that keeps growing taller. Shigaraki watched his quirk fail. He watched it the way a man watches his house burn, with the disbelief that precedes acceptance, and the awareness that what he is seeing will redefine everything that comes after it. His fingers were still pressed against Izuku's chest. Decay was still firing. The skin was still healing. The cycle ran in front of his eyes. Gray, crack, heal, smooth, gray, crack, heal, smooth. And every cycle ended with the skin looking exactly the way it had before he touched it. He had spent his entire life defining himself by this power, by the ability to end anything through touch. Everything he had ever reached for had come apart in his hands, and he had built an identity from the wreckage, the villain whose touch was death, the heir to All for One's empire, the man-child who would bring the world to its knees because his hands said so. His hands were saying so right now. His quirk was screaming its function into Izuku's cells at full volume. The cells were answering louder. Izuku looked down at the hand on his chest. He looked at it the way you look at a stain on your shirt, with mild displeasure and the faint inconvenience of having to address something beneath your attention. "You came to destroy a society," Izuku said, and his voice was even, and his eyes were red, and Shigaraki's 5 fingers were still pressed against his skin, and still accomplishing exactly as much as they had accomplished since the moment they made contact. 0. A child swinging a hammer at a building, unaware that the building's new owner is standing behind him. Izuku's hand came up. He gripped Shigaraki's wrist, the one attached to the hand pressing against his chest, and the grip was simple and total, the kind of hold that communicates through bone density and pressure alone, that the thing being held is never leaving. Shigaraki clawed at him with his free hand. Decay fired from every finger, random, frantic, the desperate assault of a man who has discovered that his defining ability is useless and cannot accept it fast enough to stop trying. The decay caught Izuku's suit sleeve and crumbled it to ash. It caught the edge of his collar and turned it to powder. It reached his skin and died on contact, smothered by cells that replaced themselves faster than they could be unmade. "You were supposed to be the final villain," Izuku said, and there was something in his tone that a generous listener might have called pity, if pity were something that still existed, in the thing wearing Izuku Midoriya's face. "Sensei raised you for this. He built you as his instrument, and the loudest sound your instrument can make is the sound of a hand scraping against a surface it cannot scratch." He snapped Shigaraki's wrist. The sound was crisp and immediate, and Shigaraki screamed, a raw, tearing sound that came from somewhere beneath his voice, from the place where the child he had been still existed and still felt pain the way children do, without processing, without context, just the animal voltage of something broken. The hand on his face fell off. It hit the floor. Father, the severed hand of the man whose family Shigaraki had destroyed as a child, the talisman he had worn since All for One found him in the street, and it landed palm up on the concrete, and Shigaraki's eyes followed it down with the expression of a man watching the last of something go. Izuku's tendrils ended it. 2 of them. Just 2. Extending from his left shoulder, moving with the efficiency of tools designed for a single task. They went through Shigaraki's torso from 2 angles, crossing inside his chest cavity, and what they did to his internal architecture was total and immediate, and left the body standing for a full second after the life had vacated it, held upright by the tendrils themselves, the way a puppet is held upright by its strings. When the tendrils withdrew, Shigaraki fell. He fell forward because the tendrils had been supporting his weight from behind, and his face hit the concrete next to the severed hand, and the final image of Tomura Shigaraki, the man who was supposed to bring down the Hero Society, the heir to All for One, the League of Villains' reason for existing, was a thin body on a floor next to a severed hand that could provide nothing anymore. The League stood in the aftermath the way bystanders stand at accident scenes, immobile, overwhelmed, running on the neurological autopilot that kicks in when the conscious mind has received more input than it can process. Compress knelt first. He lowered himself to one knee without a word, his top hat held against his chest, his masked face pointed at the floor. The gesture was practiced. Compress was a performer, a stage magician by training, and he understood that survival sometimes required performing submission when performed prestige. Performed prestige. He knelt because he was smart, and because smart people choose to breathe, Spinner knelt second. He was shaking, and the reptilian scales along his arms and face were raised in the threat display reflex of a lizard that has encountered something too large to fight. But he knelt, and his sword clattered to the floor beside him. Twice, knelt and stood, and knelt again, his 2 internal voices warring in real time. One screaming submission, the other screaming defiance. And the compromise his fractured psyche arrived at was a half kneel with one hand on the floor and his mask over his face and his eyes squeezed shut. Dabi stood against the wall where he had been standing since Izuku entered, and his blue fire was running along both arms from wrist to elbow. And his turquoise eyes, his father's eyes, the eyes of a man Izuku had killed 6 hours ago in an intersection in Shizuoka, were locked on Izuku with an expression that combined grief and rage and the particular poisonous clarity of a man who has decided that the only thing left to do is the wrong thing. "You killed Endeavor," Dabi said, and his voice was the voice of someone trying to sound steady while standing on a fault line. "You killed my father." Izuku turned his gaze on Dabi. The assessment took less than a second. It always took less than a second because the assessment was running constantly, a passive system cataloging threat levels and quirk signatures and body language at a speed that made conscious evaluation redundant. "Your father died poorly?" Izuku said. "Would you like to join him?" Dabi's answer was blue fire. The blast filled the room, a torrent of azure flame that burned hotter than Endeavor's hell flame, because Dabi's fire had always burned hotter, had always been the superior product of the quirk marriage that Endeavor had engineered and then rejected when the child it produced started burning from the inside out. The fire hit Izuku at point-blank range and did what all fire did to Izuku Midoriya. It burned flesh that was already healing and accomplished a brief, visually spectacular demonstration of the gap between what Dabi could produce and what Izuku could endure. Izuku walked through the fire. He walked through it the way he had walked through Endeavor's assault, the way he had walked through the Hasaikai's gunfire, the way he walked through everything the world put in his path. The blue flames wreathed his body and died against his skin, and the skin that emerged from the fire was new and whole, and carrying the faint heat shimmer of cells that had just completed a regeneration cycle at maximum speed. He reached Dabi in 3 steps. One tendril, a single extension of bladed flesh from his right forearm, went through Dabi's chest above the heart, pierced the wall behind him, and pinned him to the surface like a specimen mounted for display. Dabi's fire died. His hands dropped. His turquoise eyes went wide, and the expression in them was surprise, which is the expression people wear when the thing they knew was going to happen actually happens, and the knowing turns out to have been worth less than the preparing. He burned out on that wall. Tuya Todoroki, the son of the man Izuku had killed that morning, the brother of the boy who would learn about this in a phone call he would never finish listening to. The tendril withdrew. The body dropped. The blue fire that had been Dabi's identity and his inheritance guttered and went out, and the room smelled like ozone and copper, and the end of a family that had been destroying itself long before Izuku Midoriya became the thing that finished the job. Izuku looked at the surviving League members. Compress, kneeling. Spinner, kneeling. Twice, half kneeling. He evaluated them the way he evaluated all potential acquisitions. As resources, as variables, as either useful or irrelevant. You belong to me, he said, or you belong to the floor. Choose. They chose. Every one of them chose the same thing, and the choices were made with the speed and sincerity of organisms that understood, at the most fundamental level available to them, that the alternative to service was subtraction. Izuku left the safe house with 3 new subordinates. Converts pending, their Kazuki rank to be determined after transformation, and 2 bodies on the floor behind him. The League of Villains, the organization that had been positioned as the greatest threat to hero society since All for One's first rampage, ended in a condemned apartment building in Yokohama on a Thursday afternoon. With less ceremony than a landlord serving an eviction notice, the Hero Commission went to full emergency protocol the next morning. This was the protocol that existed in contingency binders marked with red tabs and stored in safes that required 2 keys and a retinal scan to open. The protocol designed for scenarios so catastrophic that the people who wrote it had done so hoping it would never be used. It was being used now. Every active hero above rank 20 was deployed. Agency rivalries, the petty, sponsorship-driven competitions that had defined hero culture for decades, evaporated overnight. Intelligence was shared freely. Resources were pooled. The number 3, 4, 5, and 6 heroes coordinated through a unified command structure that reported directly to the Commission's Emergency Directorate. A room full of analysts and strategists who were operating on caffeine and terror, and the thinning hope that organizational excellence could compensate for the fundamental problem at the center of their crisis. The thing they were organizing against had already proven, twice on camera, that the concept of enough force did not apply to it. Izuku sent the Kazuki. He sent them the way a general sends divisions, with assignments, with timetables, with the understanding that was you have infrastructure, and the method was totality. Ranks 4 through 12 deployed across 7 cities simultaneously. The attacks began at 6 a.m. and did not stop. The coordination was the thing that broke the Hero Commission's strategy. They had planned for a single-point engagement. The Demon King himself, identified, contained, overwhelmed by superior numbers. Instead, they got a multi-front war fought by 12 opponents who could each solo a top 20 hero, and who moved with the synchronized efficiency of limbs attached to the same body, because that is what they were. The Kazuki fought independently, but moved as one. Their actions coordinated through the blood link that connected each of them to Izuku, a communication system that operated below the level of radio waves and above the level of telepathy. A cellular network that transmitted intention and instruction at the speed of hemoglobin and required nothing that could be intercepted or jammed. In Sapporo, upper rank 7, a former vigilante whose vibration quirk post-conversion could crack reinforced concrete at a range of 200 meters, brought down the Hero Agency Tower in the commercial district with a single sustained pulse that started at the foundation and worked its way up through 15 floors of offices, training rooms, and situation centers. The tower didn't explode. It came apart, story by story, floor by floor. The structural connections between levels, severing in sequence from bottom to top, until the building resembled a stack of plates being pulled away by invisible hands. 8 heroes were inside. 3 made it out. In Nagoya, upper rank 9, a woman whose quirk allowed her to generate localized gravitational anomalies, amplified by demon blood into full gravitational inversion across a 3-block radius, turned a hero staging area upside down. The phrase is literal. She inverted gravity over the area for 11 seconds, and everything within the affected zone, vehicles, equipment, personnel, the asphalt itself, fell upward into the sky and then fell back down when the effect ended. The casualty count from that 11-second window exceeded the total villain-related casualties in Nagoya for the previous 5 years combined. In Fukuoka, in Sendai, in Kobe, the pattern repeated. A Kazuki would appear, engage the local hero response, demonstrate capabilities that exceeded every projection in the Hero Commission's files, and move to the next target before reinforcements could arrive. The heroes fought. They fought well, many of them, with the training and the courage and the genuine desire to protect that the best of them carried like a second heartbeat. Some of them managed to wound a Kazuki, real wounds, injuries that required seconds of regeneration instead of the usual fraction of a second. Those moments of success were celebrated in real time on the Commission's command frequency, announced like small victories in a war that was producing fewer of them by the hour. The heroes who wounded a Kizuki universally reported the same experience. The wound healed, the Kizuki turned to look at them, and the expression on the demon's face was curiosity. The brief, detached interest of something that had been hurt and found the sensation novel enough to notice before moving on. Izuku was absent from the field. He was elsewhere, doing something the story will arrive at, something that required his personal attention, while his army did the work of dismantling the hero society's body from the outside. His absence from the war was itself a statement. The Kizuki alone were enough. 12 converted organisms, each one a refraction of his power, were sufficient to bring a nation of heroes to its knees. He didn't need to be present for this part. He had larger things to attend to. Toga broke the command structure. She walked into the Hero Commission's emergency command center in Tokyo, wearing the face of a mid-level analyst named Tanaka, who had been reported missing from her apartment 3 days earlier, and whose blood Toga had consumed from a thermos she kept in the inner pocket of her jacket. The security checkpoints saw Tanaka's face, Tanaka's badge, Tanaka's retinal pattern, because Toga's transform, amplified beyond its original parameters by demon blood, replicated every biological marker of the person whose blood she had consumed, down to the capillary patterns in the retinas and the exact electrical signature of the fingerprints. She walked into the command center at 2:14 p.m., 14 hours into the Kazuki offensive. The room held 19 people, analysts, strategists, communications officers, and 4 senior commission officials who were managing the coordinated hero response. They were tired. They were scared. They were staring at screens that showed red markers spreading across a map of Japan like a disease, and they were trying to direct heroes to containment points that kept moving because the Kazuki kept moving. Toga killed the communications officer first, because the communications officer was the link between the command center and the heroes in the field, and severing that link was the difference between a coordinated defense and 200 heroes fighting alone. She did it with a knife, a single fast lateral motion across the throat while reaching past him for a coffee cup, and the blood hit the console before the body hit the floor. And the room spent 2 seconds processing what had happened before the face of analyst Tanaka melted and shifted, and the golden-eyed, grinning thing underneath it drew a second knife and went to work. The command center went silent in 90 seconds. 19 people, 4 senior officials, the entire emergency coordination apparatus, gone. The hero response across 7 cities lost its central nervous system between one heartbeat and the next. And the heroes fighting the Kazuki in Sapporo and Nagoya and Fukuoka suddenly found themselves operating without intelligence updates, without coordination, without the strategic framework that had been the only thing preventing the defense from fragmenting into isolated, disconnected fights. The defense fragmented. The heroes, left to their own initiative and their own judgment, did what heroes do in the absence of orders. They tried harder. They threw themselves at the Kazuki with more force, more commitment, more of the stubborn, beautiful, doomed courage that had made them heroes in the first place. Some of them saved civilians. Some of them held evacuation corridors open long enough for thousands of people to reach safety. Some of them stood in intersections with their quirks flaring and their bodies breaking and refused to move until the thing in front of them went through them. The Kazuki went through them. The war lasted 48 hours, measured from the first attack in Sapporo to the last engagement in Kobe. In those 48 hours, The hero agency infrastructure of Japan, the network of offices, training facilities, communications hubs, supply depots, and administrative centers that supported the hero system, was reduced to a map with more holes than substance. 17 hero agencies above the regional level were destroyed or rendered inoperable. The Hero Commission's emergency directorate was dead. The coordination framework was dead. The ranking system that had defined hero society for 2 centuries was meaningless, because the entities doing the fighting existed outside any scale the system could measure. And through all of it, the thing that had set the war in motion was elsewhere, handling something personal. Katsuki Bakugo found Izuku Midoriya on the roof of a building that used to house a hero support company. The company had been evacuated. The building was empty. The roof offered a view of the Musutafu skyline, the same skyline they had grown up under, the same towers and highways and billboard-studded facades that had been the background of every interaction they had ever had, from the playground where Bakugo first told him he was worthless to the classroom where Bakugo last told him to give up. Izuku was standing at the edge of the roof, looking out at the city. His suit was flawless. His fedora was straight. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his posture, still composed, his weight evenly distributed, was the posture of someone who owned the view and was considering what to do with it. Bakugo came through the roof access door hard enough to blow it off its hinges. He landed on the rooftop gravel in a combat stance, knees bent, palms forward, sweat already beading on his hands in the nitroglycerin preparation that preceded his explosions. His face was a study in compressed fury. Jaw locked, brows drawn, red eyes, human red, the red of anger and adrenaline and the refusal to accept a reality that every piece of evidence was confirming, burning with the particular intensity of a person who has come to fight something they know they cannot beat, and has decided that the knowing is irrelevant. He had come alone. The story said he would, and he did, because Katsuki Bakugo had never once in his life asked for help, and this was the worst possible moment to start, and the worst possible moment is exactly when Bakugo has always been the most himself. Midoriya, he said, and the name came out like he was spitting a piece of glass. Turn around. Izuku turned. He turned the way he did everything, at his own pace, unbothered by the demand, unbothered by the sparking palms and the combat stance and the rigid, trembling fury of the boy who had been his tormentor and his rival, and the first person in his life to tell him, with absolute conviction, that he was nothing. Bakugo, Izuku said, and the name carried weight, the weight of a decade of shared history, filtered through whatever translation process the thing that used to be Izuku applied to human memory. You came alone. I don't need backup, Bakugo said, and the statement was delivered with the full conviction of a young man whose entire identity was constructed on the premise of individual supremacy. Never have, and this is between us. Between us, Izuku repeated, and the corner of his mouth moved, a fraction of a degree, the suggestion of something that might have been a smile in a creature that still remembered what smiling felt like. There has never been a between us, Bakugo. There was you above and me below, and a gap that you filled with your contempt, because it was easier than looking down and seeing what was actually growing in that shadow. Bakugo attacked. The first explosion was a right-hand blast aimed at Izuku's center of mass, a concentrated detonation that cracked the rooftop gravel and sent a shockwave rippling across the building's surface, hard enough to rattle the ventilation units. Izuku didn't move. The blast hit him in the chest and scorched his shirt and pushed him back 3 inches. And that was the total impact. 3 inches of displacement and a shirt that needed replacing. Bakugo followed with a combination, left, right, left, each palm detonating in sequence, the blasts overlapping into a sustained barrage that would have leveled a concrete barrier and had, in training exercises, cracked the reinforced walls of UA's combat simulation rooms. The noise was staggering. The heat was real. The concussive force rattled windows in buildings 2 blocks away. Izuku stood in the center of it and watched. He watched the way a teacher watches a student demonstrate, with attention, with assessment, with the awareness that the demonstration has a ceiling and he has already identified where it is. Each explosion hit his body and left marks. burns that reddened his skin and faded in the time it took Bakugo to wind up the next blast. The cumulative damage was 0. The cumulative data was considerable because Izuku's cells were cataloging the nitroglycerin composition, the detonation pattern, the force vectors, and the biological mechanism that produced Bakugo's quirk with the passive thoroughness of a system that recorded everything and forgot nothing. Bakugo hit him 43 times. He used everything. Armor-piercing shots, concentrated, narrow-focus explosions that punched through steel, wide dispersal blasts that turned the rooftop into a crater field. He detonated the sweat buildup in both palms simultaneously, the maximum output move that teachers at UA had cautioned him against using because the recoil alone could dislocate his shoulders. He used it twice. Both shoulders held. The detonations hit Izuku's body with a combined force that exceeded the structural tolerance of the building they were standing on, and the roof cracked beneath them, and the floors below groaned. And through all of it, Izuku stood with his hands at his sides and his red eyes on Bakugo's face, and his expression carrying the same almost smile that had been there since Bakugo arrived. It was that expression that broke Bakugo. He realized, and the realization arrived with the weight of a building falling, which was appropriate because the building they were on was starting to list from the structural damage his explosions had caused, that Izuku was letting him. That every blast, every detonation, every ounce of force Katsuki Bakugo had poured into this fight had been permitted. That the creature standing in the smoke and rubble of his best effort was standing there by choice, absorbing the assault the way a parent absorbs a child's tantrum, present, patient, allowing the energy to exhaust itself because the alternative was to end it, and ending it would have taken less effort than standing still. Bakugo's hands dropped. The sparking stopped. His arms hung at his sides, and the muscles that had been locked in combat tension for 4 straight minutes released all at once, and the posture that resulted was something nobody who knew Katsuki Bakugo had ever seen from him. The posture of surrender. His shoulders were down, his head was level, but his eyes had lost the fire. His breathing was ragged. The breathing of a body that had spent its entire combat output against a wall that didn't care. And the silence that settled over the ruined rooftop was the loudest silence in the story. "Why?" Bakugo said, and his voice was raw, and the word wasn't a question so much as an exhalation. "Why didn't you kill me?" Izuku looked at him. The almost smile was gone. What replaced it was something else, something that occupied the space between contempt and recognition. A compound emotion that had no name because the creature experiencing it had moved beyond the taxonomy of human feeling years ago. "Because you are the last honest mirror I have," Izuku said. "Every other reflection has been broken or consumed. But you still stand there, Bakugo, with your explosions and your pride and your absolute refusal to believe that anyone is above you, and you remind me of what I decided to surpass. You are the monument to the ceiling they built for people like me, and I keep you standing the way a conqueror keeps a statue from the old regime, as proof of how far the new one has come." Bakugo's jaw worked. Something was happening behind his eyes, something private and enormous, and the kind of thing this story refuses to narrate because the internal landscape of Katsuki Bakugo is his own, and the thing standing in front of him has never asked to enter it and never will. "You're still him," Bakugo said, and the words cracked on the way out. And what came through the cracks was something that sounded like grief, but was shaped like accusation. Under all of this, the suit, the eyes, you're still that kid. You're still the one who followed All Might and asked if he could be a hero. You're still, "I am what I chose to become when the world told me I was nothing," Izuku said. And his voice was the gentlest it had been since the alley behind the train station. And the gentleness was worse than any violence because it carried the weight of finality. The voice of someone closing a book they have finished reading and setting it on a shelf they will never visit again. "You told me to pray for a better quirk in the next life. I didn't pray, Bakugo. I evolved." He walked past Bakugo. He walked past him the way he had walked past him at the USJ, with the totality of someone who has concluded an interaction and moved on. And Bakugo stood on the ruined rooftop of a building that was groaning beneath him, his hands empty and his palms cooling, and his entire understanding of his own place in the world reformatted by the last 5 minutes, and he let him go again. And the letting was the final defeat. Worse than any punch, worse than any blast, worse than anything a fight could have produced. Because a fight has a winner and a loser, and this had neither. This had a god walking away from a monument he had decided to leave standing, and a monument realizing what it means to exist after the civilization that built it has ended. All for One had been preparing. In the weeks since Kamino, weeks he had spent in a location that existed between 2 warp gates, a pocket of folded space that Kurogiri maintained at the cost of the Mist villain's constant, draining effort. All for One had been rebuilding. The arm was gone. The quirks stored in the arm were gone. But the man who called himself the Demon Lord had survived longer than the nation he lived in, and survival was a skill that improved with practice. He had drawn from reserves. Every stolen quirk he had cached in secondary locations, biological deposits, cultivated hosts, the living batteries he maintained in facilities the Hero Commission had never found, was called in. His remaining arm was restructured with 6 different strength enhancement quirks layered on top of each other. He integrated a ranged telekinesis ability that compensated for the lost limb. He added 3 new perception quirks to replace the sensory tools consumed at Kamino. He was, by any conventional measure, more dangerous than he had been at the first fight. The way a cornered animal is more dangerous than a hunting one. The desperation of the preparation visible in the density of the armament. He sent the message through channels that Izuku would find, because he wanted Izuku to find them, because the confrontation needed to happen on terms that All for One had set, in a location All for One had prepared. The message was simple: a time, a place, and the word "come" in capital letters, which was either an invitation or a command, depending on which end of the power dynamic you believed you were on. Izuku went. He went alone. He left the Kazuki at their posts. Toga in Tokyo, Stain in Yokohama, the remaining moons distributed across the cities they had just finished scouring. He told Toga where he was going, and she started to protest. And he looked at her, and the protest died in her throat, the way sound dies in a vacuum, because the look communicated everything. And the everything it communicated was, "This is mine." The location was an industrial complex on the coast of Hokkaido, a decommissioned naval facility that All for One had been using as a storage site for decades. Its underground levels converted into vaults and laboratories, and the kind of spaces that powerful men build when they need somewhere to keep their secrets and their weapons. The facility was empty of personnel. All for One had cleared it. Whatever happened in this building was going to happen between the 2 of them, and the building itself was the only witness that wouldn't flinch. Izuku walked through the facility's entrance at sunset. The light coming through the western windows was amber and red, and it painted his white suit in warm tones that made him look for a moment like someone's photograph, a young man in good clothes backlit by a dying sun, the kind of image that belongs in a frame on someone's desk. All for One was waiting in the central atrium, a vast, open space 3 stories tall with a reinforced ceiling and walls lined with the kind of structural material designed to contain explosions. He had chosen this room because it was the largest in the facility and because the reinforcement gave him material to work with. The walls were tools, the floor was a tool, the ceiling was a weapon waiting to be triggered. His remaining hand was bare. His ruined face was turned toward the entrance. His posture was upright, composed, the posture of a man who had spent a century and a half learning how to stand in rooms where he was about to kill someone. "You came alone," All for One said, and there was something in his voice that might have been satisfaction if satisfaction were something his damaged psychology could still produce cleanly. "I expected the army." "You expected the army because you needed the army to justify the preparations you've made," Izuku said, walking into the atrium with the unhurried stride that had carried him through the Hasaikai compound and the streets of Kamino, and every other space that had made the mistake of believing its walls could contain him. "You prepared for 12. I brought 1. The insult is the point." All for One attacked first. The floor erupted. a telekinetic pulse that ripped the reinforced concrete apart and hurled it at Izuku in a wave of jagged debris, each piece moving with the force and speed of a cannon shell. Behind the debris wave came a concentrated air blast, a version of air cannon modified for his remaining arm, amplified by the strength enhancement quirks layered into his muscle tissue. Behind the air blast came something new, a gravitational distortion that pulled everything in the atrium toward a single point 3 feet in front of All for One's extended hand, creating a crushing field that compressed matter into a sphere of increasing density. The debris hit Izuku and broke against him. The air blast hit Izuku and moved him back a foot. The gravitational distortion pulled at him, and he leaned into it and walked forward against the force, his shoes cracking the floor with each step as his body increased its own density to counteract the pull. A trick he had learned from his absorbed quirk catalog, a minor gravity resistance ability that some forgotten hero had once used to prevent falls, and that now served as an offhand counter to the desperate gambit of the most powerful villain in history. All for One pressed harder. He was faster this time. The additional quirks had given him speed he hadn't had at Kamino, and the facility's enclosed space gave him material to weaponize from every angle. Walls reformed into fists that struck from the sides. The ceiling dropped sections of reinforced concrete in targeted strikes. His remaining hand fired projectile after projectile, bone spurs, air lances, concentrated kinetic bolts that cracked the air with miniature sonic booms. Izuku weathered the assault for 90 seconds. He weathered it because the data was valuable. Every quirk All for One used was cataloged, analyzed, and filed by cells that treated combat as a research exercise. The bone spurs pierced him and were expelled. The kinetic bolts cratered his torso, and the craters filled in. A section of the ceiling landed on his shoulders, and he shrugged it off the way a man shrugs off a coat. The 2-ton block of reinforced concrete sliding off his back and crashing to the floor while the body underneath continued forward, undamaged, unslowed. At the 90-second mark, Izuku entered his combat form. The suit tore apart. The body beneath expanded, mass growing from internal reserves, the cellular architecture unpacking itself from its compressed human configuration into the combat chassis that had consumed the Nomu and driven All for One from Kamino. The mouths opened across his torso, dozens of them, each one independent, each one ringed with rotating teeth that caught the amber light from the windows and threw it back in patterns that made the light look wrong. The tendrils erupted from his back and shoulders, thicker than before, denser, the barbed edges moving in patterns that filled the atrium's airspace with a web of bladed flesh that left fewer and fewer gaps for All for One to maneuver through. All for One felt it. He felt it the way he had felt it at Kamino. The weight, the pressure, the biological broadcast that communicated at a frequency below thought and above instinct, that the thing unfolding in front of him was the apex of a food chain he had spent a century believing he topped. The feeling was worse this time, more thorough. The crack that Izuku had opened in his mental architecture at Kamino had never fully healed, and the pressure of the combat form's aura widened it, pushing through the repaired defenses, flooding the spaces behind them with the cold, ancient, predatory will that had spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of being the thing at the top. His strategy collapsed in pieces. The composed, centuries-old predator, the man who had broken all might, who had built and dismantled empires, who had stolen more power than any single organism in human history, felt his composure give way the way a dam gives way when the water has been pushing too long and the cracks have been spreading too slowly to register. He threw his final combination. Every remaining quirk firing at once, the telekinesis, the air cannons, the gravitational distortion, the bone spurs, 3 kinetic amplifiers, 2 concussive generators, and a nerve disruption pulse that should have shut down any nervous system it contacted. The combined assault hit Izuku's combat form with the force of a natural disaster condensed into a single sustained event, and the atrium cracked around them. Walls splitting, ceiling buckling, the reinforced structure of the building failing under the combined stress of 2 entities fighting at scales. The architecture was never designed to contain Izuku's tendrils closed around All for One. 6 of them. From 6 angles, they wrapped around his remaining arm, his torso, his legs, and they held him, suspended in the center of the atrium, 3 feet off the ground, immobilized in a cage of bladed flesh that tightened with every breath he took. His quirks fired against the restraints, and the restraints healed around the damage. His telekinesis pushed against the tendrils, and the tendrils pushed back harder. His remaining hand, trapped against his chest by the wrap of barbed tissue, fired air cannon directly into Izuku's tendril at point-blank range, and the tendril absorbed the blast and grew thicker. Izuku retracted his combat form. He pulled the additional mass back into his body, collapsed the mouths, drew in the tendrils that weren't holding All for One. What remained was the human shape, the boy's face, the green hair, the red eyes. Standing in the ruined atrium, holding the most powerful villain in history suspended in 6 lines of bladed flesh, looking up at him with an expression that held recognition. Recognition of what? Of a peer, perhaps, of the closest thing to an equal he had encountered in this world. All for One had been alive for over a century. He had accumulated power with the patience and the ambition of something that understood what it meant to build a legacy from consumption. In a different context, a different world, a different timeline, they might have been the same species. They were close enough for Izuku to acknowledge the resemblance and distant enough for the acknowledgement to carry the particular sadness of a predator recognizing itself in the thing it is about to eat. "You are the closest thing this world produced to what I am," Izuku said. "A collector, a builder, a creature that understood that power is taken, never given. In another age, I might have kept you." All for One struggled. The tendrils tightened. His ruined face, the scarred, eyeless ruin that All Might's fist had made of it, twisted with an effort that was physical and mental and existential. The effort of a thing that has been at the top of its food chain, for the concept of being consumed is an impossibility its psychology cannot metabolize. "I have lived for over a century," All for One said, and his voice was strained but still rich, still cultured, still carrying the maintained composure of a man whose pride would be the last thing to die. "I have survived everything. You cannot." "I can," Izuku said, and the tendrils pulled All for One toward him, and the mouths across his chest opened, and the consumption was total, immediate, the industrial deconstruction of a living being at the cellular level. Every quirk, every molecule, every stored ability absorbed and cataloged and filed into Izuku's expanding library. The sounds were the same as Kamino. The duration was shorter, 4 seconds, because this was complete. Every quirk All for One had spent a century collecting, every ability stolen from every victim across 100+ years of predation, every fragment of power the man had hoarded in the endless accumulation that had defined his existence. All of it now belonged to Izuku Midoriya. When it was over, the atrium was empty except for Izuku and the damage. He stood in the dying amber light from the western windows, and his body was human-shaped again, and the suit was destroyed, but the fedora was on the floor where it had fallen when the combat form emerged. He picked it up. He placed it on his head. He walked out of the facility and into the last light of the sunset, and behind him, the building that had held All for One's secrets and weapons and the final stand of the world's oldest villain began to settle on its foundations with the groaning structural sounds of something that has served its purpose and is ready to rest. All for One was gone. The man who had spent over a century stealing everyone else's power had been stolen. The most final irony in a story built from ironies, and the only eulogy it deserved, was silence. Toshinori Yagi watched the reports come in from the common room of a safe house the government had established for protected persons. The television showed footage he recognized from 20 different angles. The Kazuki assaults, the Endeavor fight, the command center breach. Newscasters with hoarse voices and the haunted expressions of people who have been broadcasting tragedy for 3 consecutive days tried to maintain professional composure while describing events that existed outside the framework their training had given them. He was thin. He was always thin now. The skeletal frame, the sunken cheeks, the hollow eyes that had once been bright blue and were now the washed-out gray of a sky that has been raining too long. His hero form was a memory. The power that had defined him, one for all, passed to him by his mentor, the accumulated strength of 8 generations of bearers, was gone, transferred to a successor, whose identity the story will leave unnamed because the successor is irrelevant to what happens next. Toshinori Yagi was a retired hero with a destroyed body and the burden of being the man who had defined an era that was ending in real time on the screen in front of him. He watched for 3 days. He watched the hero system he had built, the system his symbol had held together, the world his smile had promised was safe, come apart piece by piece, agency by agency, life by life. He watched heroes he had trained die on camera. He watched institutions he had endorsed collapse under the weight of something they were never designed to handle. On the 4th day, he stood up. Recovery Girl found him in the hallway, putting on his shoes. She was a small woman with decades of medical experience and the weary, unflinching pragmatism of someone who had spent her career putting heroes back together after the world took them apart. She looked at him, at the shoes, at the coat, at the expression on his gaunt face, and she understood immediately what he intended to do. "You'll die," she said. There was nothing diplomatic about the delivery. Your body has nothing left to give. If you activate One for All's residual power, the scraps that remain, the fraction of a fraction, your organs will shut down, your heart will stop. You won't survive the transformation, let alone a fight. Toshinori laced his shoes. His fingers, the long, thin fingers that had once closed into fists strong enough to change the weather, moved with the slow care of a man who is performing a routine action for what he knows is the final time. "I started this," he said, and his voice was the voice that the hero form had carried in whisper instead of thunder. The same voice, the same conviction, scaled down to a register that fit the broken body producing it. On a rooftop. I stood in front of a boy who asked me the most important question anyone ever asked me, and I gave him the wrong answer. Recovery Girl put her hand on his arm. "Toshinori." "He asked me if he could be a hero without a quirk," Toshinori said, and the words carried 10 years of weight, the weight of a moment he had replayed in his memory every day since the news reported a boy matching that description missing from the Musutafu waterfront. I told him he couldn't. I told him to find another path. And he did, Recovery Girl. He found another path. He found the worst path in the history of the world, and I am the one who put his feet on it. He straightened up. He was taller than his frame suggested. The skeleton remembered what it had been built for, even if the muscles and the organs and the power that had once filled it were gone. He looked at Recovery Girl with eyes that were already somewhere else. "If I am the man I claim to be," he said, "then I stand between that boy and whatever comes next. Even if standing is the last thing this body does." She let him go. She let him go because she had known him for 30 years, and she knew, with the certainty of long acquaintance, that stopping Toshinori Yagi from doing the right thing was like stopping a river from running downhill, possible in theory, absurd in practice, and ultimately a waste of the time you could spend getting out of the way. He found Izuku in the ruins of the Hero Commission's headquarters. The building in central Tokyo that had once been the administrative heart of the Hero system and was now a hollowed structure with blown-out windows and collapsed interior floors. Izuku was standing in what had been the commission chairman's office on the top floor, looking out through a window that had lost its glass at the city below. The sunset, this was behind him. The sky was orange and red. Toshinori entered through the stairwell. He climbed 11 flights of stairs on legs that shook with every step, and a body that was spending its last reserves of energy on the simple act of vertical movement. He coughed blood twice during the ascent. Bright red, arterial, the kind of blood that tells a doctor's trained eye that the internal damage has reached the point where the body is losing arguments with itself. He reached the top floor. He walked down the corridor. He entered the office. Izuku turned from the window. He looked at the man standing in the doorway, the man whose poster had hung on his bedroom wall, the man whose action figures had filled his shelves, the man whose smile had been the foundation of everything Izuku Midoriya once believed about the world. He looked at what remained, a thin, hollow-cheeked figure in a coat that hung off him like a flag on a windless day, with blood on his lip and fire in his eyes, and the absolute, irrational, magnificent stubbornness of a man who will walk into a furnace if the furnace is where the right thing needs to be done. young Midoriya, Toshinori said. And the name came out with the weight of an apology and the shape of a prayer and the texture of something that had been worn smooth by years of repetition inside a mind that never stopped turning it over. Izuku regarded him. The assessment was different here, different from the way he had assessed Endeavor or Shigaraki or All for One. There was something in his expression that the word recognition doesn't fully cover. It was deeper than that and more dangerous, because recognition implies distance. And what Izuku felt looking at All Might was something that existed at zero distance, the direct, immediate, unavoidable confrontation with the man who had shaped him, the man who had broken him, the man whose single sentence on a rooftop had been the crack through which a 1,000-year-old predator had poured itself into the body of a lonely child. "You came," Izuku said, and his tone was the same measured register it always was, but there was something underneath it. Something running below the surface like a current under ice, audible only if you knew what to listen for, and only if you had known the boy before the thing consumed him. "I came because I owe you a different answer," Toshinori said. He stepped into the office. His footsteps were unsteady. His body was shaking. The fine, involuntary tremor of a system operating beyond its tolerances. "I owe you the truth I should have given you on that rooftop. You could have been a hero, Izuku. You had everything. The heart, the mind, the will. You had everything that matters, and I was too tired and too afraid of my own weakness to see it. And so you told me I was nothing," Izuku said, "and I believed you. For 11 minutes, I stood on that roof, and I believed the strongest man in the world when he told me I was nothing. And then something older than you, older than this society, older than the concept of heroism itself, woke up inside me and disagreed." Toshinori's eyes glistened. The emotion on his face was naked, stripped of the smile, stripped of the persona, the raw and bleeding regret of a man confronting the consequences of his worst moment. His fists clenched at his sides and the bones cracked audibly, and the sound was small and final and honest in a way that the rest of the world had stopped being. He transformed. The power that remained, the dregs, the residual charge of one for all that clung to his cells the way static clings to fabric, surged through his body and his frame expanded. Muscle filled the hollow spaces. Bone thickened. The coat that had hung loose split at the seams as his shoulders broadened and his chest expanded, and the iconic silhouette of the symbol of peace assembled itself one last time from the broken materials of a body that had given everything it had and was now giving the things it didn't have. He was smaller than he'd been in his prime. The form was incomplete. The left side of his torso remained thin. The wound from All for One's original attack visible as a concavity where muscle should have been. His face was All Might's face, but older, drawn, the smile that had reassured a generation now carrying the particular ache of something being performed for the last time. He was magnificent. Let me say that, because someone should. In that ruined office, with the sunset behind him and the blood on his chin and the power guttering through his veins like a candle flame in a windstorm, Toshinori Yagi was magnificent. He was everything the hero society had believed in, everything Izuku had once worshipped, everything the word hero had ever tried to mean, compressed into a single, shaking, dying frame that refused to sit down. "I will stand in your way," All Might said, and his voice was the voice, the big one, the broadcast voice, the one that had told a nation everything was fine and made them believe it. "I will stand here because that is what I do. It is what I have always done. And when this body breaks, it will break facing you, because you deserved a man who faced you, Izuku. You always did." Izuku watched him. His red eyes took in the hero form, the reduced mass, the asymmetrical build, the trembling in the limbs that suggested the form had minutes left, maybe less. He saw what All Might was spending and understood, with the comprehensive awareness of something that had consumed enough quirk factors to build an encyclopedia of human capability, that the expenditure was fatal. All Might was burning the candle and the table and the room the table sat in, and when the fire went out, there would be nothing left to relight. "Then come," Izuku said, and he removed his fedora and set it on the desk beside him. The desk that had once belonged to the chairman of the Hero Commission, a man currently listed as missing who would stay listed as missing because the toga who had visited the command center had been thorough, and the act of removing the hat was a courtesy. A recognition that what was about to happen deserved a form of respect that Izuku had extended to nobody else in this story. All Might charged. The first punch hit Izuku in the center of the chest, and the impact blew out every remaining window on the top floor of the building. The force was real, reduced from its prime, a fraction of the power that had once changed weather patterns and created pressure waves visible from orbit, but still enough to crack mountains and bend steel and send shockwaves through the building's structure that made the lower floors groan. Izuku's feet left the ground. He traveled backward 8 feet, hit the wall behind him, and went through it. Through the wall, through the office beyond, through the exterior wall of the building, and out into the open air of the Tokyo skyline, falling for 1 second before landing on the roof of the adjacent building with an impact that cratered the surface. All Might followed. He jumped through the gap, covering the distance between buildings in a single bound, and he landed on the adjacent roof with a force that cracked it corner to corner and hit Izuku again. A left hook that carried every ounce of remaining power. Aimed at the jaw, connecting with a sound like a thunderclap compressed to the size of a fist, Izuku's head snapped to the side. His jaw cracked and reformed in the same instant. He tasted blood. His own, briefly, before his body metabolized it and the taste vanished. All Might hit him again, and again. A barrage of punches that would have been called desperate if the man throwing them had been anyone else, but coming from All Might, the punches were something else. They were devotion, commitment, the physical manifestation of a man's entire belief system expressed through the only language his body still knew how to speak. Each punch cracked the air. Each punch pushed Izuku back a step. Each punch healed in the time between impacts. The damage erased before the next fist arrived, and the pattern, hit, heal, played out across the rooftop like a drumbeat marking time on a clock that was running out for one of them and irrelevant to the other. Izuku let him. He stood in the center of All Might's assault and let it happen. He did what he had done with Bakugo. Absorbed the impact, healed the damage, let the attacker spend everything they had against a surface that would always rebuild. But the intention here was different. With Bakugo, the letting had been a lesson. With All Might, the letting was something else. Something that existed in the space between tribute and torment. A thing Izuku was doing because the man hitting him was the man who had made him and the man who had broken him. And both of those facts deserved a response. And the response was this: I will stand here and let you give me everything you have, because you owe me that, and I owe you the chance to give it. All Might's fists were bleeding. The skin across his knuckles had split 3 punches ago, and the regeneration the hero form provided was insufficient to keep up with the damage his own strikes were inflicting on hands that were hitting something harder than anything they had ever encountered. His breathing was ragged. His form was flickering. The muscle mass receding for half-second intervals before surging back, the power that sustained the transformation stuttering like an engine running on fumes. He drew back his right arm. He planted his left foot. He torqued his entire body, hips, shoulders, spine, every joint and tendon and muscle fiber that the hero form still had access to, into a single, final, devastating rotation. United States of Smash! The punch hit Izuku in the chest and the world went white. The shockwave blew the roof off the building they were standing on. It cracked the buildings on either side. It sent a pressure wave through the Tokyo skyline that broke windows for 6 blocks in every direction and set off every car alarm in the district. The sound was enormous, beyond volume, beyond description, a sound that existed at the threshold of what the human ear could process and was felt as much as heard. A vibration that traveled through the ground and up through the foundations of adjacent structures and into the bodies of every person within a mile radius. Izuku stood in the center of the impact crater. His chest was caved in. The punch had done what punches do. It had deformed the surface it hit, compressing the ribcage, rupturing the organs beneath, creating a concavity in Izuku's torso that exposed the working interior of his body to the open air. For 1 second, 1 actual measurable second the damage held. The regeneration paused. The cells at the edge of the wound hung in a state between destruction and reconstruction, and the pause was the closest thing to victory that any attack had ever achieved against Izuku Midoriya's body. Then the cells closed. The ribcage reformed, the organs rebuilt, the skin sealed over the wound, and the body that had absorbed the strongest punch All Might had ever thrown stood in the crater, whole and unmarked, and the expression on Izuku's face was an expression that this story has been building toward since the first word. It was sadness. Real sadness. The kind that comes from somewhere beneath the monster and the millennium and the consumed souls and the stolen quirks, from the place where a 14-year-old boy once stood on a rooftop and asked if he could be a hero, and received the wrong answer from the only man whose answer mattered. That man was now standing in front of him with bleeding fists and a fading form and the absolute ruinous courage of someone who has given everything and knows the giving is finished. All Might's form collapsed. The muscle receded. The bone shrank. The hero, the symbol, the pillar, the man whose fist held the sky up for an entire generation, deflated like a balloon, losing the last of its air, and what remained was Toshinori Yagi, thin and gaunt and coughing blood on the broken rooftop with his fists still raised and his eyes still forward and his body refusing to fall, even though falling was the only thing it had the structural capacity to do. Izuku looked at him. The red eyes held the blue ones. Between them, across 3 feet of broken concrete and 20 years of divergent evolution and the full weight of every choice that had brought them to this rooftop, something passed. Something wordless and enormous and true in a way that truth rarely gets to be in stories about monsters and heroes, because truth requires 2 people who understand each other. And in this moment, in the wreckage and the sunset and the stillness between a dying man and the god he created by accident, understanding was the only thing left. "You could have been a hero," Toshinori whispered, and his voice was small and broken and came from the man behind the myth. The human being behind the symbol, the person who had made a mistake on a rooftop and spent every day since regretting it. "You should have been the greatest of us." Izuku stepped forward. He stood in front of All Might, in front of Toshinori Yagi, who was 5 feet 11 inches of exhausted, bleeding, emptied humanity. And he looked down at the man whose poster he had once slept beneath, and the sadness in his eyes was joined by something else. A recognition so complete it bordered on gratitude, because All Might had come, because he had fought, because he had thrown everything he had against the thing his mistake had made and had refused to flinch when it survived. "I am what you made, Toshinori," Izuku said, and his voice was level and clear and free of malice, which made it worse than malice because it carried instead the weight of a verdict delivered without anger. The kind of sentence that falls on the condemned from a height too great for rage to reach. "You told me I could be nothing. I became everything. The distance between those 2 words is the distance between the man you were and the god I am, and I will carry what you gave me, the lesson, the rejection, the 11 minutes on that rooftop, for as long as I exist, which will be forever." He extended one hand. The fingertip of his index finger, the same fingertip that had pierced Toga's neck, that had delivered the blood that converted the first of his Kizuki, touched Toshinori Yagi's chest, directly over his heart. He felt the heartbeat, irregular, fading, the rhythm of a man whose body had used its last reserves and was shutting down with the resigned efficiency of a system that understood it had reached the end of its operational capacity. He could have converted him. The thought existed. He could feel it in his cells, the instinct to inject, to rewrite, to add this man's body and this man's legacy to the architecture of his empire. The symbol of peace, reborn as a demon, kneeling at the feet of the boy he failed. The image was powerful enough that even Izuku's 1,000-year-old strategic mind lingered on it for a moment. He withdrew his hand. "I will give you this," Izuku said. "You are the only person in this world who will hear me say it. You were worthy. You were wrong, and your wrongness created me, and the world will burn for it. But you were worthy of the title you carried. You earned it. You paid for it. And the payment is accepted." Toshinori's legs gave out. He went to his knees, the same posture as the Kizuki, though The resemblance was a coincidence the universe had arranged for maximum emotional damage. His hands were on the concrete. His head was bowed. The blood from his coughing was pooling between his palms. Izuku turned from him. He picked up his fedora from the rubble. It had been blown from the adjacent building by the shockwave and had landed on this rooftop with the persistence of an accessory that refused to be left behind. He placed it on his head. He walked to the edge of the roof. Behind him, Toshinori Yagi collapsed. He went from his knees to his side and from his side to his back, and his eyes, open, looking up at the sky that was orange and red and fading toward the deep blue of evening, stayed open, but the light behind them was going out. The heart that had powered the symbol of peace for a generation was stopping, and the sound it made, the final, stuttering rhythm of a muscle that had been overtaxed beyond any medical definition of survival, was the sound of an era ending. 1 beat, 2 beats, a pause, a final half-formed contraction that was more memory than motion. All Might died on a rooftop in Tokyo with the sunset fading around him, and the boy he had failed standing at the edge, looking out at a city that would learn about his death in the morning and would grieve in the particular, world-altering way that people grieve when the thing believed would always protect them, turns out to have been mortal all along. Izuku stood at the edge and looked at the city. Behind him, the body of the symbol of peace cooled in the evening air. Below him, the lights of Tokyo were coming on. Street lights and building lights and the neon signs that had always made the city look alive, even now, even when the institutions that had governed that life were rubble. And the heroes who had protected it were dead or broken or kneeling in warehouses with someone else's blood in their veins. The weeks that followed were the weeks the world changed. There was never a single moment, never an announcement, never a ceremony where Izuku Midoriya stood at a podium and proclaimed himself ruler of anything. That was the thing the media kept waiting for and the thing that never came, because Izuku understood, with the instinct of something that had been building empires since before the concept of a press conference existed, that the most durable power is the kind that never needs to announce itself. It simply exists. It fills the space. It becomes the environment. And the people living inside the environment adapt to it the way organisms adapt to gravity, unconsciously, completely. Because the alternative to adaptation is ceasing to function. The Hero Commission was dismantled. The phrase "was dismantled" is doing a lot of lifting in that sentence because the actual process involved more complexity than a passive verb can convey. There were resignations, arrests, facility seizures, the wholesale absorption of intelligence archives by operatives who reported to the Kizuki, and the particular bureaucratic extinction that occurs when every person in an organization's leadership structure has been removed, and the people remaining lack both the authority and the will to continue operating. The Commission's headquarters became a ruin. Its regional offices were converted. Its databases, containing the hero registry, the villain registry, the classified files that documented every quirk, every operation, every secret the hero system had accumulated over 2 centuries, were absorbed into a network that Izuku maintained through the Blood Link, distributed across 12 minds that served as living servers for information the public and the government would never access again. The ranking system ended. The hero agencies that survived the Kazuki offensive, the smaller ones, the local ones, the neighborhood outfits staffed by heroes who had been too far below the radar to warrant targeting, found themselves operating in a world without a structure. Some of them kept going. They patrolled their blocks. They responded to fires, to accidents, to the mundane crises that existed independently of demon kings and fallen commissions. They did what heroes do, which is help. And they did it without logos or sponsors or rankings, and some of them, a few, the ones who had entered the profession for the right reasons, found that the work felt more honest without the apparatus. Those heroes were tolerated. Izuku's standing order to the Kizuki regarding local heroes was simple: leave the small ones alone unless they interfere. The small ones are furniture. Furniture is useful when it stays in place. The underworld submitted. The criminal organizations that had spent decades hiding from heroes discovered that hiding from the Kizuki was a different proposition entirely, one that required either swearing allegiance or accepting consequences that made the Hero Commission's enforcement look like a friendly warning. Most swore allegiance. The ones who resisted provided examples that made the next round of negotiations shorter. The government, what remained of it, attempted negotiation. Envoys were sent, messages were drafted, formal requests for dialogue were submitted through channels that the Kazuki monitored with the passive attention of wolves watching sheep try to figure out the fence. Izuku never responded. His silence was the response. The government understood, through the grinding education of watching its hero system destroyed and its enforcement apparatus consumed, that negotiation requires two parties who exist on the same plane. And the plane Izuku occupied was unreachable from where they were standing. International agencies made calls. Foreign hero organizations, the American Hero Association, the European Union Hero Council, agencies from Korea and China and Australia, whose combined rosters included heroes who could crack mountains and freeze oceans, offered assistance that Japan accepted on paper and never received in practice, because the logistics of deploying foreign heroes into a nation whose infrastructure had been redesigned by an organism that could absorb any quirk it encountered presented a strategic problem that none of the offering agencies could solve without risking the same losses Japan had already suffered. The world watched Japan the way the world watches natural disasters, with sympathy, with fear, with the unspoken, shameful relief of people who are glad it is happening somewhere else. Izuku was seen in the weeks after the fall. He walked the streets of what had been the busiest commercial district in Musutafu, a district operating at half capacity because half the workforce had relocated, and the other half was adjusting to a world where the thing that had destroyed the hero system might be walking past their storefront on any given morning. He wore his suit. He wore his fedora. Toga walked beside him, at his side now, the promotion in proximity a statement that even the civilians could read. Stain walked 3 steps behind them both, his sword on his back, his red-ringed eyes scanning everything with the perpetual vigilance of a weapon that never powers down. They looked from a distance like a young couple being followed by a bodyguard. The civilians who passed them on the street had varying reactions. Most averted their eyes. Some crossed the street. A few, the very brave or the very curious or the very young, looked directly at him, and what they saw was a face that the news had been showing for weeks, except the face in person was younger than they expected. He looked like a teenager. He looked like someone's son. One civilian spoke to him directly. She was 6 years old. She was holding her mother's hand, and the mother was doing everything in her power to walk past the thing on the sidewalk without acknowledging its existence. The way you walk past a lightning storm and pretend you're comfortable with the proximity. The child had different priorities. Children always have different priorities because the fear response that governs adult behavior has to be taught, and this child hadn't finished the curriculum. "Are you going to hurt us?" the child asked, looking up at Izuku with wide brown eyes and the straightforward curiosity of someone who wants information and has learned that asking for it usually works. Izuku stopped. Toga stopped. Stain's hand went to his sword hilt out of reflex and relaxed when the threat assessment returned null. The mother froze. The full-body lockup of a parent who has just realized that her child has attracted the direct attention of the apex predator of the modern world, and the tools available to her for managing this situation amount to exactly 0. Izuku looked at the child for a long moment. His red eyes, he was wearing his true eyes today, because concealment was a habit he had discarded along with the rest of the pretenses the old world required, settled on the girl's face, and the expression in them was unreadable in the way that the expressions of something genuinely alien are unreadable. You can see the face moving, you can see the muscles adjusting, but the emotional content behind the adjustment is being produced by a system you don't have the hardware to decode. "That depends entirely," he said, "on how smart your parents are." The mother pulled her daughter away with a speed that suggested she had received the message and was acting on it immediately. The child looked over her shoulder as she was led away, and the look on her face was the look of someone who has received an answer that created more questions, which is the most honest outcome any conversation with Izuku Midoriya has ever produced. he walked on. Toga fell into step beside him, and the smile on her face was the smile of someone who has found the world exactly as funny as it is terrifying and has decided to enjoy the comedy because the alternative is standing still. And standing still has never been in Toga's repertoire. The final scene of this story happens at the edge of evening. The sky is clear. The city is spread out below a vantage point. The top of a building that used to bear the logo of a hero agency whose name nobody remembers anymore because the agency was destroyed 3 weeks ago, and the culture that produced it has already started the process of forgetting, the way cultures always forget the things they can afford to lose. Izuku stands at the edge. The wind moves through his hair. Green, unchanged, the one physical feature that has remained constant through every transformation and every evolution, the genetic marker of Izuku Midoriya's son, persisting in the body of something that has moved beyond every category the world has for it. His suit is white tonight, a new one, tailored from fabric that Toga sourced from a designer's studio in Ginza. The fedora is the same. The fedora is always the same. Toga sits on the ledge beside him, her legs dangling over the drop, kicking them idly the way a child kicks their legs from a chair that's too tall. Her knives are sheathed, her golden red eyes reflect the city lights below. She is looking at him the way she always looks at him, with an intensity that has moved past devotion into something that resembles a fundamental law, an orientation as fixed and as ungovernable as magnetic north. "It's pretty," she says, looking down at the city. "All the lights." Stain stands behind them, 3 steps back, sword across his back, eyes forward. The man who killed fake heroes stands guard over the thing that killed heroes entirely. And the distance between what he was and what he is sits in his shadow like a stone he will carry forever without ever setting down, because the muscles that would let him set it down were removed during the conversion and replaced with fibers that only know how to serve. The other Kazuki are below. Spread across the city, across the country, across the infrastructure of a world that belongs to the thing standing on this rooftop. They are present the way a body's cells are present, distributed, active, each one performing its role in the larger organism, connected through the blood link that makes 12 individuals into extensions of a single will. The hero system is gone. The villain system is gone. The binary that defined this world for 2 centuries. Heroes and villains, light and shadow, the endless, cyclical struggle that kept both sides employed and the public anxious and the ranking boards turning, has been replaced by something simpler. There is the world. There is the thing that owns it. The space between those 2 facts is where everyone else lives now. Izuku looks out at the city. He breathes. The air carries the sounds of a world adjusting, traffic and conversation and the distant hum of a civilization that is learning, hour by hour, to live under a new ceiling, a ceiling that has a heartbeat and red eyes, and the particular patience of something that intends to be here for a very long time. Somewhere below, a mother is telling her daughter to eat her vegetables. Somewhere below, a man is locking his shop for the night and checking the sky the way his grandparents used to check the sky. Because the instinct to look for predators never left the human genome, and is now, for the first time in 2 centuries, relevant again. Somewhere below, a retired hero, one of the local ones, one of the small ones, who was left standing because the new regime found her useful, is putting on her costume for a night patrol and pretending the weight of it feels the same as it used to, knowing it never will again. And going anyway because the work still needs doing, even if the world it serves has changed beyond her ability to recognize it. Toga leans against his shoulder. He permits it. He has always permitted it, the way kings permit rituals that reinforce the structure of the court. Her devotion is a pillar, and pillars serve a purpose, and the warmth of her head against his arm is something he registers and files under data that matters in whatever small and residual corner of his consciousness still maintains a filing system for things that used to be called feelings. The city hums below him. The lights burn. The wind moves through the hair of a boy who was told he was nothing and became the thing that owns everything. And Izuku Midoriya looks at the skyline of the world he has taken and speaks the last words this story will carry. Words meant for the city, for the country, for the species still learning to live in the shadow of something that walks in daylight and plans to keep walking forever. They spent 2 centuries building a world around heroes. I will spend the next 1,000 building one around myself.
The Hero Roster. A massive salute to the legends backing this journey. Your support is what keeps the momentum at an all-time high and the dream moving forward. You guys are the absolute best. Pro Heroes. The elite front line, stepping up and setting the pace for the whole community. DA, Fire 05.
Symbol of peace. The pillars of the community, the titans who keep our foundation solid and the hype at an all-time high. Aries Bryant, Jonah Wheeler, T-Mac, XXHJRI 3AS 7X. Wolf, Hyper Beams, Michael Murphy, Grand Region Kell, Sin Hunter, Deshaun Jones, Logan Bland, Alexander Johannes, Alex Morgan, Ray Various, Blaze, That Other Guy Too, Chad Reynolds, Zachariah Allison, T. Mackey 68 Rimuru, Nuh-uh, Kelvin Bowman, AZ Othros, Dweller of the Deepest Depths, Lone Wolf, The Lone One, Jacob Rops, Bully McGuire Shadow, Ameri B, Neostar Productions, Aciel Cardenas, Shaquan Simmons, Thunder, Elijah Saunders, Peter Hamilton, Freddie Rose, Omega, Akuma no Akami, Chris Talley, Remorsefuls, Black Vein, Joshua Hedrington, Aaron Abercrombie, Drift SK8er, Akeno Himejima, Corey Tokars, Kwan Yen Thompson, Yan, Devin Black, Crow, Dasher Games, Joe Bros, Rai Von Crimson River, Dante Alistor, Adam Yonkers, Blood Saints, Donna Cafe, Zeph, Howie60, Ignacio, Carlos Terry. Hope of the universe, the ultimate guardians, celestial tier supporters whose impact literally shines across the galaxy. Voidwrought, Chaos Umbre, Noroi Uzumaki Uchiha, Keishon, Tayshawn Palmer, Coldbane 4, The Maniac 563, Debs, LS Morningstar, Marl, Spintown, Ike's Shoot 50, Greg Green, James, Juan, Zeno KJ. Holy shit, what a blood-soaked rise. If you want more savage what-ifs where the underdog becomes the nightmare that ends everything, smash that like button, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss when the next legend gets devoured. Thanks for watching, Legends. Stay ruthless.